Good morning, and welcome to Gonzaga U and to Spokane. It is such an honor and pleasure to be here today, and I am filled with gratitude for everyone who has joined us at this year's in-person Columbia River Transboundary Water Governance and Ethics Symposium. We are happy to be amongst you, all of you. The last in-person event was in 2019, where we met in Kimberley, and again online in 2021 and 2023. We are here today to support the well-being of the Columbia River Basin, its people, and all living things, but especially because of the water and the salmon. And what a success the salmon are having this year. They have shown the will to come home, but that coming home has also depended on our will to help create a safe space for their journey. We too have displayed the will to work together, collaboratively and respectfully, and to forge ahead together in relationship. The organization of this event has taken the will and hard work of many people to bring us all face to face again. We live in unprecedented times, climatic events, industrial growth that continues unabated, polluting the environment and the river. I believe we can bring together solutions, ideas, and paths forward to overcome these challenges. Today, we have seen the fruits of that labor, with not only the people together again in this room, but with the salmon returning home. These two events could not have been done without the unity in the belief that we can work together towards the same cause, unified in our love of the river and the salmon. Thank you, everyone, for being here today in this room and for rolling up your sleeves for what will be a couple of days of deep, compassionate, and respectful thinking, listening, and engagement for our future and for the next 7 generations. Thank you. Before we get started with the morning plenary, I would like to remind everyone of the Chatham House rules. You no doubt have seen them in the many emails that we've been sending out, but just to reiterate one more time, to encourage open dialogue while encouraging media coverage, media are here today, we use a modification of the Chatham House rules. The original Chatham House rules allow participants in a meeting, including media, to share information from the meeting, but they must do so without attribution to either the identity or affiliation of the speaker, source, or of the information. The restriction on attribution applies only to private and informal conversations at this symposium, to allow media reporting on panel presentations and public Q&A. This means that the rule of non-attribution does not apply to panel presentations or Q&A, but it does apply to breakout sessions and informal discussions. As a participant in an informal discussion, you are free to agree with the media representative to allow attribution of a comment to you. I just want to mention a little bit about the keynote speaker tonight. Dr. Jeanette Armstrong is going to focus on areas of thought intended to encourage strengthening an evolving collaborative One River approach centered upon the river's Indigenous peoples, vital participation, leadership, and guidance in the renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty, for the restoration of salmon and the cultural and ecological health along the Columbia River. The keynote will share thoughts on this historical, inter-areal, cooperative, and interlocutory governances that endured for thousands of years along the river and its relevance in these times of the two governments to meet obligations required by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The keynote will revisit the intent expressed by tribal and religious leaders signing of the Declaration on Ethics and Modernizing the CRT, the Columbia River Treaty, sent 10 years ago to the governments of Canada and the United States on September 23, 2014. The keynote will share a primary example of the achievements that were directly a result of a fully Indigenous-led, collective and collaborative work across boundaries and levels of government in the restoration of salmon on the Okanagan tributary of the Columbia River. I would like to now invite the speakers of the morning plenary session to speak. Each speaker will be introduced by the speaker preceding them. So I will introduce Maureen, and Maureen will introduce the next speaker, and so on. Okay, I'd like to introduce my co-MC, Maureen DeHaan. Maureen is an environmental scientist and technical advisor, and I now call upon Maureen to give a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Joanne. Good morning, everyone. I would like to invite you to join with me in acknowledging the homelands of the Spokane tribal people, where we are gathered here at Gonzaga University. We are grateful to be on this land, for the people who stewarded it, and ask that the ancestors of this land be with us in our discussions over the next 2 days on how we will care for the Columbia River under a modernized treaty. I would like to now introduce Monica Tascet, who will be our first plenary speaker. Monica currently serves on the Spokane Tribal Business Council as the council secretary. She has 29 years experience working in various positions at casinos, enterprises, and tribal government, and 25 years of experience in positions such as supervisory, managerial, and directorship. She has spent the majority of her career as a human resources director and administrative director for the Spokane tribe. Monica graduated from Gonzaga University with a bachelor's degree in general studies with a concentration in organizational leadership. She serves, she serves as a founder and mentor of the Spokane Tribal Youth Council and serves on a variety of boards in the areas of health, education, natural resources, and environmental justice. She is a mother of 4 and is very involved with her family and community and enjoys participating in community events. I'd like to ask Monica to the stage.
Monica Tascet. Good morning, everyone. I see some familiar faces in here, and I'm just honored to be able to speak today. And I thank you for the land acknowledgement. As she said, this is the ancestral lands of the Spokane Tribe of Indians, and we had been here since time immemorial. And we once inhabited over 3 million acres of land in this area. So when I was asked to speak at this event today, I got directions that said, talk about your historical context to this event today. And my story has a number of dimensions to it. As you heard, I graduated from Gonzaga. I spent, 4 years here. And this school is special as well because this school was actually built to serve Native Americans. And then I think about just the Columbia River and the salmon. And so to tell you my story, first of all, I never write anything that I say. My grandmother always told me, you speak from the heart, and that's how you connect with people. But as I was thinking about what I would say today and about the Columbia River, I always think of my ancestors, and I think of my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, who was raised on the river. They're boarding school survivors. Their parents moved towards the boarding school so they could be next to their kids. And so my grandfather was connected to the river, great-grandfather. Then my grandfather was also connected to the river. He lived on the west end of the Spokane Indian Reservation on the river. He was born in 1919, and he was a World War II vet. He was a boarding school survivor as well. But my story about him is about his loss and connection to the river and to the salmon, because he has a story, his family story is, that their home was on the river, and when Grand Coulee Dam was built, they watched their home go underwater. There's a story of his two sisters sitting on the hillside watching the water cover their home. And then, I think of him in his last years of his life. He spent his last years of his life on a boat on a river with archaeologists, the young archaeologists in the tribe, sharing his story about the history of the river and what life was on the river. And then, I think of myself and my connection to the river, and I've always been connected to the river. And I don't know if any of you have ever been able to spend time at a salmon release. The first time I was able to be part of a salmon release, we did a cultural release down at the Shimmikin Creek, and that is just over the hill from my house. And we hadn't had salmon in that creek for 111 years. And to be able to be part of that event and have my kids involved in that event, it was such a spiritual experience for me, and I just thought of my grandfathers, and their experience of, living through a time where they saw an abundance of salmon, and then also, my grandfather living most of his life without salmon. And I didn't really understand my connection to salmon at that point. I remember being little and going fishing with my dad, and I remember he had this ugly salmon on the wall. It was this wooden salmon, and I thought, why does my dad have that? That is so ugly. And then, I got to do that salmon release, and then I realized salmon and I are meant to be together. And the last 4 years that I've been in serving in the capacity that I do, I've got opportunities to be a part of many salmon releases now. And the first time we got to put salmon in the Little Spokane River, it had been 80 years since we were able to do that. And so I think about my connection to the salmon and to the river. And I think about I'm here today to really set the tone for you today. And I think each and every one of you here today is here because you're meant to be here. And it is no mistake that you're in this room or in this line of work that you are, because we have a responsibility to take care of the land and the animals, the salmon, and to pay respect to our ancestors and to our animal and fish ancestors. And the whole reason why we do all of this work is for our future generations, so that the grandkids, our great-grandkids, we'll never meet them, great-greats, all those future generations that will depend on us to take care of our resources today. So with that, I just want to wish you all a very great day, and that we move forward with our day with love in our hearts and clear minds, and that we just continue fulfilling our purpose and doing the good work that I know each of you do, and make our ancestors proud and build a good future for our future generations. So with that, I just want to say lam lamsh, and I just wish you a blessed day. Thank you. I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Jay Johnson. Jade is the Chief Negotiator and Senior Policy Advisor to the Chiefs Executive Council of the Sinai Okanagan Nation, a powerful southern interior tribal council in BC operating on 69,000 kilometers? I didn't know I was have to do math today. Of territory that includes the Okanagan, Similkameen Valleys, the West Coutneys. Jay has worked to represent and advance First Nations title and rights interests to over 15 years, and has concluded a number of agreements, and has led a variety of natural resource, fisheries, and energy sector initiatives and relationships, including acting as the Sonics Nation's lead negotiator for the Columbia River Treaty in the Canada-U.S. negotiations. He is also the BC First Nations Leadership Council's provincial coordinator of the First Nations Gaming Commission, has been a special advisor to 3 BC cabinet ministers, and has worked on international development projects in Jordan, Egypt, Mexico, and the Caribbean. He has taught international political economy and Indigenous governance at the University of Alberta and Athabasca University and the University of Victoria, where he and 2 sons currently live. Sorry for butchering that, but I know you're amazing. So welcome, Jay.
My name is Jay Johnson. Thank you for that introduction, by the way. It's a little bit old because it said 15 years, and it's actually more like 22 now. So we've all been at this a very, very long time. I just want to say how honored I am to be here, and what my life journey has been an incredible privilege, and I'm very humbled by what I've been able to see and do and accomplish and participate in over the years, and how much I've learned from the Syilx Nation, and helping to represent the interests of the Chiefs Executive Council in a variety of settings, both with government and industry on the land, and doing our best to set up the systems to ensure that the voice of the communities and the people is heard and respected. And the Columbia River is no exception to that, except it extends that voice to an international setting. And it's been a long and hard journey, but one that has been also richly rewarding too. And there's incredible people on both sides of the table that work together to move this work forward in a good way, with open hearts and open minds. And I think that's the lesson that I draw from, no pun intended, from the river. And what it brings to us is that the river shapes our landscape, but it also shapes our relationships. And the success of bringing the salmon back into the upper Columbia is still ongoing, and will be an effort that will require everyone on both sides of the border, because it's one river. The river doesn't know the border. We put the border in. Colonial forces put the border in and separated communities and land, in very much an artificial way, but the river persists, and it shows us that we're united. And no matter where you are in the river, up or down, or one of the main tributaries or a small tributary, you're connected. And so we're all connected. And the keynote species of the salmon coming up and down the river reminds us that every day of how important our relationship is to each other and to the river. And we have to continue to work hard together to ensure success, to ensure that the salmon come back. And we've fortunately have some good examples of that happening and being able to overcome the obstacles that are in the way of not only the salmon, but in the whole process of ensuring that we have a fruitful future. So I would just like to maybe just add a little bit about how important partnerships are. The success of the salmon coming up in the Okanagan system is a result of a lot of hard work. It's a result of ceremony. It's a result of cultural practices. It's a result of Indigenous knowledge being applied on the land and listening to the knowledge of the elders and knowing where to put rocks, how to ensure that the habitat is restored, that the oxbows are returned, that the channels that were put in from settlers are restored back as best they can to spawning habitat, and merging Western science with Indigenous knowledge and having those two forces start to move forward in a good way. And then the missing link was the ceremony. And when the elders and the knowledge keepers came to the foreshore and started to sing to the salmon again and pray, that was the difference. That was the year where not many salmon came back, and then the next year they came back. And they've continued to do so, and they've continued to persist through difficult conditions and through climate change and warmer rivers. But none of that could have happened without partnerships. None of that could have happened without partnerships north-south, east-west. And one of the beautiful things that's happened with the Columbia River Treaty is that people have come together, and we've been able to put aside differences, and that's true in the South, in the United States, it's true in Canada, and come with open hearts and open minds and really focus on an outcome that's good for everyone. And when that happens, beautiful things happen, and success happens. So I just want to wish everyone a wonderful experience the next couple of days, and share your knowledge and your insight and ask your questions and network together and just make that fabric a richer and more rewarding experience for everyone. So, lim lim, thank you. I forgot to do my job. I'd like to introduce Brian Haney. He is a professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Gonzaga University, and I believe he's also the founder and inaugural director of the Gonzaga Climate Institute. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for joining us here on Gonzaga University's campus next to the beautiful Spokane River. If the weather cooperates during a break, just head that way and you'll hit the river. It's really worth taking a visit to. On behalf of Gonzaga University and the Climate Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our campus. Informed by an abiding commitment to a just society and care for the planet, the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment was created in 2021 to engage in regional capacity building, scholarship, and teaching to promote the flourishing of inland Northwest communities, waters, and lands in the face of a rapidly changing climate. We envision a transition to integral Earth-human relations characterized by thriving, equitable human societies within flourishing ecological communities. And hosting events like this is central to the work that we do, and we're honored to be here with you and play host to you. I want to take just 1 minute to extend thanks to all the members of the University Consortium on Columbia River Governance that is making this event possible. As you know, these things don't happen without a lot of hard work. And I want to express special thanks to two of our colleagues from the University of British Columbia, Dr. Joanne Taylor. Join me in thanking her. As as well as Rayanne, are you in the room, who is our other wonderful collaborator from University of British Columbia. Thank her as well, even though she's outside doing important work. Thank you, Rayanne. And then finally, my colleague, Caitlin Carroll from the Climate Institute, who was the lead on our side in organizing this event, and I want to thank her for all of the work that she's done to make that happen as well. Yes, we should thank her. Thank you. It's appropriate that we're hosting this event because it was 10 years ago this year that the first One River Ethics Matter conference was hosted here in this very room in 2014. And so it's nice to be able to continue that tradition. And as many of you here know, that series of events that's been held annually, I believe, up and down the watershed has been hosted by Dr. John Osborne in particular, as well as many of his colleagues. And so it's my pleasure to introduce him to speak next. Dr. Osborne is a physician and a conservationist. He works in the ER for Veterans Administration in Seattle and coordinates the Vashon MRC and directs the medical division for COVID disaster activation on Vashon Island. He served as conservation chair for Sierra Club's Upper Columbia River Group since 1983 and currently leads the Sierra Club's Columbia River Treaty Working Group with tribes and First Nations to modernize the Columbia River Treaty and restore salmon above the Grand Coulee Dam. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Osborne.
The river is sacred. People will put aside their differences to heal the river and bring back salmon. Those words were shared with me by Virgil Seymour when we were driving north to meet with Anglican Archbishop John Privet and Roman Catholic Bishop John Corveau when we were getting ready for we're trying to lay the groundwork and invite both faith leaders to a conference in Revelstoke, which would bring together the 4 Indigenous nations north of the 49th parallel. I visited John in his hospital room not long after that, and he died in 2015. But in many ways, those words really carry on, that people will put aside their differences to heal the river and bring back the salmon. So briefly, I'm here because my wife Rachel published an article, Climate Change and the Columbia River Treaty. She taught water law here and at the University of Washington, and I carried her suitcase to a conference in Polson in 2012, hosted by a group I'd never heard of, the Universities Consortium. And I had lunch with Keith Cutchins and others. And I asked, would you like, tribal staff, would you like help with the Columbia River Treaty? And the answer was yes. So with that, I've always felt that we were invited in by the tribal sovereigns to help. And so we put together, Rachel and I and others began the process. We put together the NGO Treaty Caucus. We soaked in the hot springs at Ainsworth with Eileen Delahanty Perks, and then met with Greg Nellison and put together the roundtable, and we first met in 2013 in November and have been meeting monthly since. We put together the Columbia River team for Sierra Club and to try to link in Sierra Club US with the Victoria office. And then we also built on the work that we have done in ethics here in Spokane, both with residency training in response to the AIDS epidemic, the work that we did on improving end-of-life care, to adapt some of the tools that we use taking care of patients to sick ecosystems. And so it's our bedside to streamside work. We met with Bishop Skillstad, who had recently published the Columbia River Pastoral Letter through the bishops on both sides of the border. And then I met with Tom Soldner, who had done work, is a retired Lutheran pastor, but had done work in Namibia and South Africa during apartheid, and knew Truth and Reconciliation. And with that, we began the One River Ethics Matter project. We met with the Vatican after the conference here to present, make sure they knew of the pastoral letter and the need for ethics-based decision-making when it comes to the environment. And that's what this is about. It is to improve the quality of ethical decision-making, whether it's at the bedside or at the stream side. And I'll speak more about that tomorrow and some of the ethical principles involved. So with that, I want to introduce the next presenter. It's Dr. Aaron Wolf. And I should say it's been such a thrill to work with the Universities Consortium on Columbia River governance. I mean, talk about a powerhouse of experts. And one of those is Aaron. He's a water resources geographer at Oregon State University and a trained mediator and facilitator. He co-directs the program in water conflict management and transformation, through which he has offered workshops, facilitations, and mediations around the world. He is, in fact, we met with, in July. In July, we had a Zoom meeting. It had to account for the 7-hour difference because Aaron was in Israel. So it's truly someone who thinks about water at the global level. So he is the author, most recently, of The Spirit of Dialogue: Lessons from Faith Traditions in Transforming Conflict, that he uses to bring facilitation and capacity building to a variety of conflict settings, notably between entities who share water resources, and also in faith and interfaith communities and within and between government agencies. He has an appointment as a professor of water cooperation and diplomacy at IHE Delft Institute in Water Education in the Netherlands, and is a partner at 4 World Partners. Aaron?
What an honor to be here, and for this to actually happen, I gotta say, yeah, it takes more than a village. It takes a watershed to make this happen. And I like this map a lot. I think this is exactly the kind of thinking that we're hoping to bring. There's no borders on that map, right? As Jay mentioned in his talk, the only thing that's emphasized here is the basin itself. And the only thing that we see are the connections. It's surface water, groundwater, quality, quantity. There's no nations, there's no separations. It's only us in the basin who are all connected. And I think that's what we're hoping to do. And we all kind of know it. How many water professionals are here? Like your lives are around water? Okay. So you know, right? The basin is the thing, and that's what gets us in the door. And then we're faced with all the divisions, and that's the roots of the university's partnership kind of came about precisely because of that. In the early 2000s, people started to talk about this treaty that was set to sunset, or some components were set to sunset. And a number of the academics kept seeing each other at meetings. And what we noticed is that the dialogues were happening separately. There was a Canadian dialogue going on, there was a US dialogue going on, there were tribal dialogues going on, but it's a basin, right? And there was no basin-wide dialogue. And so we as universities, most of us land-grant public universities in each of the basin states and provinces, said, you know what, this is part of our mission. Let's get some border dialogue going, because the bottom line is, and let's face it, no offense to those from DC or Ottawa, we have a lot more in common here in the region than we do with the folks on the other side of our respective countries. By the way, just as an aside, Canadians, if you find Americans getting really, really friendly with you over the next couple of days, they're jostling to follow you back to Canada. That's what's going to be happening. Anyway, with Barb Cousins, with Richard Paisley at UBC, Matt McKinney at the University of Montana, we just basically did what universities do: open up the halls and say, "Come, let's start to chat." And we recognized quickly the old treaty did a couple of things well: did hydropower well, flood control well, did not do tribal representation well, had no components for public participation, and did not treat the environment as an integral third leg of the stool. And those were really, really important. And at the time, we would go and we'd say, "Hey guys, these are 3 things that need fixing." And we'd be told, "Sorry, we have this treaty, it's fixed, it's not going to expire until 2014 and 2024. And so we're now hoping with the folks in the room to say, "Hey, let's not make that same mistake. We know this next one's going to be 20 years. Let's make sure that those 3 things are integral parts." So over the years, we had tremendous support from people like Kindy Gossel, John Schertz. I see a couple of people from those early meetings. In 2009, we started to have those meetings. And Kathy is still going strong. And Jim Heffernan is still, a couple of folks from those times 15 years ago have been sticking through. But it's more of a delight to see the young generation. So it was a joy to partner with One River Ethics Matter, a joy to partner with the Youth Parliament, to be able to say, yes, we're all connected to this basin, and let's treat it that way. And especially at this sensitive time, while we're crafting a new version, let's make sure that our interests, the interests of the people and wildlife of the basin, are solidified in there. So with that, I want a special honor to introduce the next speaker, who's the head representative of the Youth Parliament, Henry Pitts, USA co-president in the North American Youth Parliament for Water. You'll hear more about them in the course of the event. He's also a PhD student at Oregon State University, go Beavs, where he recently earned a master's in water resource policy and management, which he just turned in a week ago. So he's now officially a master of water resources. Give him a big round of applause for that. He's also a terrific mediator and facilitator in his own right, which you'll see over the course of the next couple of days and beyond. So Henry, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, my name is Henry Pitts. I'm the USA co-president for the North American Youth Parliament for Water. We're a youth-led nonprofit that works across the North American region. So as a regional chapter of the World Youth Parliament for Water, our kind of key mission is really to foster these types of youth-led initiatives that advance sustainable water governance. So we connect leaders anywhere between the ages of 18 to 35, so it's a very expansive and inclusive definition of youth. With opportunities to influence water policy, to connect on water research, and really to advocate for sustainable governance in spaces like this. So this is our 2nd year being involved in the formal planning process for the symposium. Last year, we were really pleased to have a youth-focused panel where we gathered youth perspectives from across the basin. But this year, it was really important to us to not just silo those youth and young perspectives into one panel and really to integrate those perspectives throughout the entirety of the symposium. So we have a suite of youth engagement and programming opportunities. Yesterday, we had a 3-hour training on water facilitation and advocacy. You'll see other rapporteurs and note takers throughout the symposium taking notes that will go into a final youth report. And then later this afternoon during the breakout sessions, you'll also see a youth adjunct facilitator alongside you. So we just want to thank you all for letting us be in these spaces. As young people, the river's future is our future. And involving us now early in our careers really benefits both the river and sustainable management for the future. And as I hope you see, once you let us get our foot in the door, we do have a lot to say. And I hope that you find an opportunity to speak to a young person over the next 2 days. And next, I will introduce John Wagner. Dr. John Wagner is a professor of environmental anthropology in the Department of Community, Culture, and Global Studies in the Irving K. Barber Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. John conducts research on human-water relations in the Okanagan Valley, in the Columbia River Basin in Canada, the United States, and in Papua New Guinea. In the Columbia River Basin research, John focuses on water governance and the relationship of the treaty to irrigation, food security, and Indigenous rights. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Henry. Well, let me say, first of all, it's such a pleasure to look out over this fairly large room and see it full of people who actually came to this symposium that we organized. You know, as a member of the steering committee for this year's symposium and last year's virtual symposium, but as a bit of a newbie to this kind of organizing compared to Aaron, for instance, and John Osborne, it's been a real learning experience. All right, so my job is just to give you a run of the day, basically for what's actually happening today. You have your programs, but just as a reminder to everybody, our sequence and a few extra details. So we're going to start with panel 1, the Columbia River Treaty modernization process, in just a couple of minutes. Thank you to Barb Cousins for organizing this first panel. And thank you so much to the negotiating teams from Canada and the United States for being able to set aside time and come. And I know there have been elections on both sides of the borders that were threatening maybe your ability to do so, and we so appreciate your coming. So we'll have presentations from the Canadian and U.S. negotiating team members. There'll be a coffee break after that session, and then we'll move on at 11 o'clock to panel 2. Perspectives on Columbia River Treaty modernization. So this will be responses from organizations in the Basin to negotiating team presentations, and they will discuss other AIP, Agreement of Principle issues and concerns as they see them. This panel will also be moderated by Barb, and at the beginning of panel 1, I think, Barb will explain how the Q&A opportunities from the floor will work for both of those panels. At this point, I think it would be good for me to point out how the gifts that we're going to give to all the speakers are going to work. So the gifts are arranged on the table down here. So all of our speakers, there are so many people who have contributed to creating and running this symposium, but we are formally gifting everybody who's on the agenda as an invited speaker. So at the end of each panel, basically we'll present those gifts to the speakers as they leave. And so the gifts are two gifts, and one are cans of Okanagan salmon, donated to us by Okanagan Nation Alliance. And as you've already heard, salmon is so important, so what a wonderful and appropriate gift that is. I do want to, however, respect the fact that there will be some members here who are not meat eaters. And so you certainly should feel comfortable, depending on your own dietary preferences, to decline either of the gifts, but the salmon is a wonderful gift that's available. The second gift is a book. So in the case of the books, there are 2 different books. You only get to take one. Just take one book. Okay, so one is The Celilo Way, Indian Salmons and Law on the Columbia River. Celilo Falls, Lake Kettle Falls, of course, was a major gathering and salmon fishing place from time immemorial. So this book, and now I'm reading words really that John Osborne has provided, because these books come from John, via John. So this book is a gift to the speakers from Professor Bill Rogers, one of his co-authors, along with Joseph Dupree and Kathleen Hill. Bill Rogers was one of the great minds in American jurisprudence who fought to stop pollution from smelters from Montana to Puget Sound and helped author many of America's fundamental environmental laws. Before he died, he asked Rachel Osborne, one of his students, and John, to find these books a home. So we're very happy, and John has very generously brought these books as gifts for our speakers. But he only had 19 books left, and we have many more speakers than that. So we were able, at a discount price, to get some other really wonderful books, actually through UBC Press, my home university. But this is a book called The River of Memory, and many of you will know it. River of Memory, The Everlasting Columbia, an award-winning collection of essays, poems, photographs, and illustrations, edited by Bill Lehman with the support of the Wenatchee Valley Museum and Cultural Center. So a choice of those two books. Okay, so after panel 2, we'll stop for lunch, and that will be served here in this room. Don't have to go anywhere. We're going to provide you with lunch. Panel 3 is the climate change panel, which starts at 1 o'clock, and that's been organized and will be moderated by Dr. Brian Henning. Speakers will be addressing climate change from multiple perspectives of ethics, science, and policy. There'll be a coffee break, and then at 2:45 we're going to have our breakout group sessions. So I'm the moderator of the breakout groups. I'm hoping it's not going to get too messy as we reorganize all the tables and get people to make a choice of which topic they would like to mainly focus on during the breakout groups. We are hoping the breakout groups will result in very productive discussions and sharings of information, ideas, and knowledge, but also in some recommendations that we can carry forward in our final report from the symposium. Recommendations that might have to do with the agreement of principle and the modernized treaty process, or beyond that, or outside of that. I hope you will have all received an email inviting you to please review the topics that we have chosen for the breakout groups, so that everybody can be prepared to go to the table that they would prefer. We'll spend the first 15 minutes getting set up, and then we have 60 minutes for the actual discussions. Okay, so at 4:15, there will be a networking break and a poster session. Beverage and food opportunities. You should bring your drink ticket to the networking break. This is going to be in another building, though, the Hemmingson Center, so we'll have to move from this building to Hemmingson. Brian, would I be wrong to say it's over here somewhere? Okay, I would. It's over here. Yeah. We have maps in the program. Follow the maps. So it's on the 3rd floor multipurpose rooms. And then we'll come downstairs for 6 o'clock. So don't overdo it with your drinks and your food at the networking break. There's going to be more at 6 o'clock. We have our banquet at 6 o'clock and our keynote speaker. So this is also in the Hemmingson Center Ballroom, so easy to find. Is the ballroom just on the bottom floor? Top floor, okay. So dinner begins at 6. Please do try to arrive at 6 because we want to get everybody's their food and be ready for our keynote speaker, Jeanette Armstrong, by 7. We do have some leeway with our closing time, but the keynote is scheduled to start at 7. We have an hour with Jeanette for her talk and question and answer afterwards. Yeah, if it goes over, we do have that flexible time as well. The title of her keynote is Singing Together, One River, which I think is such a wonderful message that echoes what other people have already said about why it is we're here. Very quickly, day 2. So we will meet back here in the morning of day 2, but we will be moving to the convention center, the Spokane Convention Center, for the afternoon. Unfortunately, we were not able, Gonzaga, there's a lot going on at Gonzaga University, a lot of other groups competing for spaces here. So we have this room for the morning, and panel 4 will be our first panel at 8:30 on water quality. Transboundary pollution and its effects on salmon and Indigenous people. And panel 5 to follow that at 10:15, Salmon reintroduction above Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam, which will feature films from both the CR, SRI, and UCUT. And then there will be a box lunch. So as you make your way from this building to the convention center, we will have people, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, who will lead you over there. If you're not sure of the way, there will be walking groups, and we will certainly give you a lot more directions of how to get there and park, et cetera, et cetera. But you will have a box lunch, so pick up your box lunch as soon as we end our second panel in the morning. You can eat it here, or as you please, make your way over to the Spokane Center for our first panel at 1 o'clock, which is the Introduction to Shared River Basin Governance that will be co-moderated by Aaron Wolf and Henry Pitts. And our concluding event is the Governance Roundtable, also in the Convention Center. Okay, welcome once more, and let's get started.
And we have one more introduction, which we neglected to do at the start. So I would like to introduce Dr. Joanne Taylor, who is the chair of the symposium. She is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Fellow at UBCO. She's an environmental anthropologist and political ecologist, and received her PhD from the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, in the Department of Community, Culture, and Global Studies. Taylor's doctoral research investigated food security and food sovereignty in the traditional lands of the Ktunaxa First Nation and the Akanuki of the Creston Valley of British Columbia during catastrophic climate change and the renegotiation of the bilateral governance model in the Columbia River Basin. For this project, she works with Dr. John Wagner, whom you've just heard from, and the Universities Consortium on Columbia River Governance to create a platform for education and dialogue concerning critical basin issues such as water quality, salmon reintroduction, personhood for water bodies, and climate change. Joanne and her two sons live in the beautiful Silks Okanagan territory in Kelowna, BC. Please thank our chair, Dr. Joanne Taylor.
Okay, well, just a few housekeeping items. Washrooms are out into the entry area where you came in to register. In case of an emergency, there are exits here, and I believe the muster area is in front of the church, and Brian can correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, in front of the church. Okay, and I just wanted to point you to the beautiful rendering that Tim did in 2014, which we were able to get our hands on, photocopy, and bring to the symposium. So maybe you could look at some of the messages that we were talking about 10 years ago here in Spokane, and many of them are still the same. On that note, I would like to let you know that speakers come up on this side of the stage, and they exit on that side of the stage to pick up their gifts, as John had explained. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Barb Cousins, member of the University Consortium and Distinguished Professor Emerita from the University of Idaho, who will be moderating this panel. Barb, over to you.
Thank you, Joanne. I was really disappointed to hear that youth stops at 35, so thought I was in it. I'd like to ask my panels to go ahead and come up, and we'll give us just a few minutes to get seated here, and we will continue. I know for those of you watching your clock and really wanting to hear from these next panels, we will take the full amount of time for the panel. We'll go a little bit into break for Q&A, but we will also provide an opportunity to ask questions later. Well, welcome. It's wonderful to see familiar faces as well as new faces out there. As you know, in 2013, the reviews of the Columbia River Treaty between the United States and Canada that had entered into force in 1964 were completed on both sides of the international boundary. And in 2018, negotiations began toward a modernized treaty. On July 11th of this year, an agreement in principle was released to the public, and we are really excited to have members of the Columbia River Treaty modernization teams from both the United States and Canada here today to help us understand the agreement in principle and the steps that will be taken towards modernization of the treaty. We will have a full 90 minutes for presentation, and that'll be followed by question and answer. Please place your questions on the cards. There's both cards and pins provided at every table, and then pass them to the people that will be circulating through the room to collect them. We may not have time, we probably won't have time to get through all of the questions. The questions that we don't get to will be provided to the negotiating teams. So it's worth it to get them down on paper. I'm now going to turn the microphone over to the lead negotiators, Jill Smale with the U.S. Department of State and Stephen Gluck with Global Affairs Canada. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you an update on Columbia River Treaty modernization. I'm keeping my remarks tight to 4 minutes so that everybody will have an opportunity to speak. You know, there's just so much to cram into a few minutes on this process, which since I've joined has been 7 years. We know how important the Columbia River and the treaty is to everyone in this room and in the region. We were extremely pleased that President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau could make the announcement in July that we had reached such a major milestone in negotiations. And throughout the negotiations, we listened to diverse groups and frequently turned to the 2013 regional recommendation as a useful guide. Consultation with the Columbia Basin tribes informed U.S. negotiating positions prior to and throughout the negotiations. And we are grateful for the wisdom provided by some tribal expert advisors who participated in the negotiating sessions with Canada and were instrumental in developing some of these building blocks that we announced in July. One of the invaluable opportunities we had was bringing several tribes in the United States and First Nations in Canada together for an ecosystem workshop hosted here in Spokane in October 2022. Sharing perspectives, and matter of fact, we were probably less than half a mile from here. That sharing perspectives, visions on the future, details about ongoing work from the headwaters to the estuary shape the building blocks that were announced in July. Another key moment was the opportunity for several of us to participate in a salmon release ceremony in May 2023 outside of Kelowna, BC, where we were all able to be together and share in such a special moment. I'd also like to note that I recognize several names associated with this conference from our virtual public listening sessions and town halls we've hosted. We attentively listened to the views expressed in those sessions and considered them carefully throughout the negotiations. And if you wonder if you do email us, I'm the person who sits behind the Columbia River Treaty email address, and I read every single email that we've gotten. And a lot of people have not just given their spoken statements, but also sent written statements to us, which is very helpful. As a result, the building blocks we've collaboratively developed with Canada represents a delicate balance between the United States and Canada's operational objectives. In defining operations and compensation, the modernized treaty cannot perfectly satisfy all purposes, but the outcome does represent a balance that is acceptable to both countries. In terms of next steps, the agreement in principle still needs to be finalized as treaty amendments and/or other implementing arrangements, which we are actively working on. Until both countries complete domestic processes for entry into force, the United States and Canada are working to make arrangements that, if implemented, will allow interim measures to transition treaty operations to a modernized future. We reached this agreement in principle milestone less than 3 weeks before this current operating year began on August 1st. So our teams had to prioritize planning for the current operating and water year. Along with operating plans for power coordination, BPA and their counterparts in BC concluded a transmission arrangement that Hub's going to brief more on. We hope to implement interim arrangements for flood risk management very soon that uses funds provided to us to the Corps by Congress at the beginning of this fiscal year, which was in October. And the US and Canadian implementing entities are also in discussions on how we could continue implementing flow augmentation as we have for the past several years. So with that brief update, it's Steve's turn.
Hold for me.
Want me to hold it
Yeah,
for you?
this is an example of the collaboration that we've been gotten to know, and where the border doesn't matter, right? We can each hold each other's mics. So thank you, Jill. I will, since Jill covered off a lot of the next steps, I'll skip over that part and just briefly, before I introduce the Canadian team, who will actually give you the real meat of what's in the AIP and the understandings that we've come together on. I also just want to reflect for just a few seconds in terms of how the process unfolded over the years. I've been doing this for several years now. As a matter of fact, if I want to sneak into the youth group, I will say I started this when I was 12, and so I'm still under 35, I think. Anyway, it was a long process, and I have to say, when we first started, it was very much a traditional process. We would go talk to British Columbia. It was governments saying, we have to negotiate, we have to renegotiate this treaty, this is how we do it, and so on. And then we started listening and having conversations with our First Nations. We went into the basin and we're talking to people in the basin. I have to admit, it was a change in how we traditionally do things, and whether it's international negotiations or other things that we're practiced on. And while none of you would be surprised about how actually important and how much it changes your perspective to go out and talk to people who are living every day with these things, it made a huge difference in what I think we achieved in the AIP and what we're going to achieve going forward from hopefully getting to a treaty that is implemented, as well as all the work that's going to go on in the future, because it doesn't end with signatures on a piece of paper. There is going to be years and years of collaboration and work needed to accomplish the things that we have negotiated thus far, and so on. So again, my big thanks, first of all, I should look at my fellow panelists on this side as well as on the US side, and just really thank all of you for all your work, all your insights, all your perspectives that brought us to where we are right now, and will hopefully keep driving us forward in what we accomplish in a modernized CRT. So with that, I'll stop for now and turn to the experts on this side, and on the US side, I'll introduce our, I think I was told I'm supposed to introduce people, so I will, and then maybe you can touch on yours. So just directly to my right, Kathy Eichenberger, who I'm sure most of you know from the BC government, and the lead BC negotiator on the Columbia River Treaty. Next to Kathy, Nathan Matthew from the Secwepemc Nation, and the Secwepemc lead on this CRT negotiations as well. Troy Hunter from the Ktunaxa Nation as well, and Troy is the Ktunaxa lead on the CRT negotiations. Jay Johnson, who you've already heard from this morning. Jay Johnson, Silks Okanagan Nation, and the lead for the Silks Okanagan. And of course, you've also met Maureen DeHaan, who is also working with Troy on the Ktunaxa Nation for the CRT. So with that.
Okay, No, that's all right. I'll just introduce the team. Pete Dickerson from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Hub Adams from the Bonneville Power Administration, Billy Barquin, Coutney Tribe of Idaho, Michael Tehan, NOAA Fisheries, and Roland Springer from the Bureau of Reclamation.
Thanks, Jill. As Jill said, I'm Pete Dickerson with the Corps of Engineers. I work in the Northwestern Division office. It's our regional office based out of Portland, Oregon. And we cover both the Columbia River Basin as well as the Missouri River Basin. But my focus is Columbia River, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today as we're doing a little history, although it's a drop in the bucket compared to some people in this room. I think I'm maybe tied with Kathy, of the person who's worked on this like sort of full-time the longest. I started in 2009. My boss asked me to move out of my job and work full-time on the Columbia River Treaty, preparing for the negotiations, which obviously didn't start for a very long time after that. But it's been a long road, and so I'm happy to be here and to talk to you all today about some of the details of the agreement in principle that Stephen and Jill discussed. So I'm going to talk about the flood risk management provisions, the differences of what flood risk management is going to be in the future versus what it was for the first 60 years of the treaty. So I think everybody probably knows, but I'm going to say it. Like, the one change that was built into the treaty was the flood risk management provision, specifically the pre-planned flood risk management. And what that means is essentially it's an operation that's one of the first things that's put into the base. How are we going to operate each reservoir as part of a system? And those flood risk management rules, when we say pre-planned FRM, it means it's one of the first things that goes in and is sort of a hard rule that is only ignored with a lot of coordination, analysis, those types of things. And so basically, prior to September 2024, the U.S. had 8.95 million acre-feet of reservoir storage in Canada as part of the Columbia River Treaty, dedicated for flood risk management in the United States. That was the one part of the original treaty that entered into force in 1964. It also said 60 years from the day it enters into force, that amount goes to zero. And so one of the big things we talked about over and over and over in these negotiations was, what, if any, pre-planned FRM volume are we going to have in the future of the Columbia River Treaty, and how would that volume be operated, basically? We're going to talk a lot about flexibility in this panel, and so one of the things that allows for flexibility is modified or reduced volumes of pre-planned flood risk management storage. So that was a big foundational conversation throughout this whole process. So I think everyone knows the new number in the agreement in principle going forward is 3.6 million acre-feet of pre-planned FRM storage, and that storage is specifically at Keenleyside Dam, or Arrow Lakes Reservoir behind Keenleyside Dam, which is the more critical dam from a flood risk management perspective to have that pre-planned flood risk management storage. Now, it is a slight reduction in storage from what the U.S. Relies on today at Arrow Lakes, and I'm going to take this opportunity to put in a shameless plug. In early December, probably the first week, maybe second week of December, the Corps is going to have a public meeting following up on our public meetings last year that we called Real-Time FRM, and we're basically going to lay out for the public, open to both sides of the border, of course, what our plan is for FRM operations for this coming water year. And you'll understand why we're kind of late in doing that in a second. But I think I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share with folks that we are doing that, because we want to make sure we have a good audience for that conversation. So going back to the operation real quick, the 3.6 million acre-feet is going to be operated very much like today. We have, the agreement in principle didn't develop an operating plan. We don't have that level of detail, but it was very clear and prescriptive in terms of, the operation would be very, very similar, if not, almost the same to how we operate the 8.9 million acre feet today. That volume just goes down. And so we've been working on trying to figure out sort of how that works, because it is a different regime to have a lower volume of pre-planned FRM, but those discussions are going well. So I'm not going to get into the modernized treaty text that Jill described. That's something that we're looking forward to those discussions. But more importantly, as the core and as part of the United States entity that implements the treaty right now, we still have an active treaty right now. Part of what the agreement in principle allowed was for the entities, with the blessing of the parties of the treaty, to enter into what we call interim arrangements. So the entities can enter into an arrangement to execute the 3.6 million acre feet of pre-planned FRM that's part of the agreement in principle during this interim period. So we've been having discussions with BPA, the Corps, and BC Hydro, the Canadian entity, working on trying to get that implementation done in this interim period. We're not done with that yet, but as I said, we're getting up to the point where the Corps needs to go out and talk to the public and tell you all what the plan is for FRM so that all of the other operations can have more certainty and knowledge about what the operations are going to be in the Columbia River Basin reservoirs, and then we can add operations for other purposes, for example, fish. And so that's the work that we've been really focused on over the last couple months. As I said, we're not done with it yet, but in early December, we will have a public meeting hosted by the Corps. We should announce it about 2 weeks beforehand, and we will let you all know how those conversations went and what our plans are for operations this winter and spring. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kathy.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to be uncharacteristically brief because a lot of what I could supplement is what Pete really described really well, but also because BC, we shortly after the AIP, we produced a video that we have on our website explaining the AIP in conceptual terms, and then after that we had a virtual public session by Zoom where people were able to ask questions and get some answers, and those products are on our website. So if people want more information, you can go there. I'm just going to say that FRM was a primary reason for why the CRT was created 60 years ago. We actually celebrated the 60 years in September 14th, and we reminisced on and recognized what was good, but also what can be improved, and that's what we've been working towards. There will be some changes, of course, as Pete described. The 3.6 MAF in Arrow Lakes Reservoir, people ask, well, why there? It's because it is the most efficient and effective storage to reduce flood damage and flood risk in the United States, but it also benefits Castlegar and Trail, so it is also an important function for us. But also, because it's a reduction, there will be lesser constraints on FRM constraints on how we operate the reservoirs. They'll still be operated for power, we'll hear about it later, and also allow for more flexibility, but the constraints to provide flood storage goes from 8.95 to 3.6, and it does provide a little bit of more flexibility. The only other thing I do want to mention is that the United States still can call upon Canada when there are major or significant flood events anticipated. In the agreement principle, both countries have committed to a process to reach a common understanding on when called upon would be triggered and how it would be implemented. And people ask, well, over the last 60 years, how come you haven't figured that out? because we hadn't needed it since then, and now is a good opportunity to try and find a common understanding on how it would all work if and when it's ever triggered. So I will just leave it at that and look forward to hearing from folks and their questions. Thank you.
All right, I guess it's my turn now to talk about the, maybe not the main focus from why many of you are here today on the energy side, but I know there are probably other topics that are going to be more interesting, but we do want to cover it because it was an important part of the AIP, and it really was, I would say, and I think many on the panel would agree, essential to really bringing the whole deal home, basically, and getting alignment on the power and transmission pieces allowed us to fulfill all the other stuff we've been talking about for the many years in advance. So it is an important piece. I had some kind of lengthy remarks, but I may shorten those a little bit. But I do want to start out, so I'm going to also just acknowledge that I'm going to turn it over to Kathy once again, have her remarks on this part as well after I'm done here. So really on the energy side, at Bonneville, we really did see this as a win-win result that we got. It continues the collaboration, long history of collaboration we've had between the Pacific Northwest and BC on energy matters and addressing power needs. And it really allows us to continue to each serve our customers with low-cost power. So that's really important for the region, obviously. That said, I do want to take a moment to also reflect on something that Jill mentioned on the public meetings we had throughout this process. And at Bonneville, you know, I know people want to just say all we care about is power, but I will say, for me at least, that's not true. And I think it's true for many at Bonneville Power Administration, even though power is in our name. Hearing from like Henry and Aaron and others, I'm sure many of you in this room during the public process about the importance of the ecosystem and increasing voices in the process was very thought-provoking and really caused a lot of reflection and was very useful in thinking about how can we more fully integrate ecosystem needs and other voices into this process. So I did want to share that and acknowledge that. That was a very valuable contribution by, I'm sure, many of you in this room. So let me now kind of just share a little more on the specifics of the energy pieces. Sorry, I'm going to be juggling my paper here while I do this. So on the power, so the energy part of the deal really had a couple pieces. It had the power side and transmission side. On the power side, there was operational aspects as well as benefit sharing. So on the operational aspect, that is one of the things that we were able to get in place by August 1st was, got it done a little afterwards, but it was effective basically during that period, an operating plan, which we call the Assured Operating Plan, that allowed us to work together with Canada, with BC Hydro, to continue coordinated power operations. So that's very critical because without that certainty of those operations and the stability of those operations, it really has the potential to undermine achieving a lot of the other objectives, including environmental and ecosystem objectives. So having that foundation laid early on is really useful for moving forward with all the other pieces, as Pete was talking about. So now we have that in place, so that's good, and it gives us a lot of good certainty and stability moving forward so we can continue to make good progress on ecosystem efforts in the US as well. The other piece is the benefit sharing. And so I think on that piece, what we once again came to was something that was really fair and equitable to both countries over the 20-year period of modernization. So we were able to land on a benefit sharing that provides Canada with its share, known as the Canadian Entitlement, or CE, that approximates the true value of power coordination when you look at all the factors, both quantitative and qualitative, that go into the value of coordination. We also, again, avoided a lot of disruption and potentially protracted disagreements over what those CE amounts would be. We were kind of setting up for having very different views on inputs and assumptions that could feed into that calculation. And without that piece resolved, it would have been another area where we wouldn't have been aligning and been unable to really move towards modernization and bringing other pieces like ecosystem and JEB and other pieces into, which you'll hear about later, into the fold of the treaty. So that was pretty critical to align on that as well. So I really do want to reiterate that even on the entitlement, you know, there's some really critical intangible elements of that that are brought by the certainty and the stability of that really shouldn't be discounted. And you know, it really wasn't just a dollars and cents equation. It was looking at all the pieces of this together and seeing how we could improve on the whole arrangement. So briefly on the transmission side, that has a couple elements as well. And I think they're going to both really be beneficial and valuable to both the U.S. and British Columbia. The first of these involves a transfer of some of the current transmission rights that we have on our transmission system that BPA has held for many years to deliver the Canadian entitlement. We're basically transitioning those rights to an entity named by Canada, which is PowerX. Using our normal processes. We actually got that done as well November 1st. So that arrangement has gone into effect and we've done that transfer of those rights. And that really helps Bonneville, because in the way it helps Bonneville is it alleviates the cost for us, because with the rights go the costs associated with those rights. So for us, for Bonneville and the United States, it helps reduce costs basically, which is helpful for our ratepayers. And for Canada, which Kathy will talk about some, it increases some opportunities, and not only for marketing, but also to meet their Canadian power needs as well. So again, another win-win kind of situation, if you will. Let me see here, sorry. So, the second piece then is something that's still kind of being developed, and that is looking at a potential expansion of transmission on the east side. So generally in this area, some of our existing lines, improving those lines most likely, but there could be other opportunities as well to make some transmission improvements. And this is partially to implement some provisions of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, of 2021. And within that act, there was a provision that set up the ability for Bonneville to explore looking at those improvements in order to facilitate non-carbon emitting electric power transactions. And that's exactly what we would intend to do with those improvements. So again, we'll be working using our normal processes with British Columbia to study the potential expansion in this area, and then go through normal domestic processes. If those studies develop a study plan, so in the United States, we'll go through NEPA, tribal consultations, all the usual stuff if there's actual construction that we need to do to implement those provisions, to move towards hopefully construction at some point in the future. So before I turn over to Kathy, I'll just say, looking at the power and transmission pieces together, I think we really did get a result that brings substantial financial relief to Bonneville and the region's ratepayers while maintaining significant value for Canada. And I will tell you, this was not an easy task. It was a lot of hard work by both delegations, particularly in the last 6 to 9 months leading up to the agreement in principle. But again, really, really worth the effort, I would say. And it is important, again, to keep in mind that if we hadn't been able to get to this agreement in principle on a modernized treaty, we were looking at a lot of years potentially of disagreements moving forward on plans for power operations and entitlement. And that would have brought a lot of uncertainty, instability, and really, frankly, disruption on our ability to not only coordinate on power, but again, affecting other purposes and needs and objectives, whether it's having effect on FRM or on ecosystem. So it really was a good foundational result that we achieved, and really positive, and we're looking forward to continue to work on moving forward to implementing further. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Thanks, Hub. I'm watching the gentleman with the stop sign in the front there, so I won't take too much time. I won't repeat what Hub said. He went over the basics, but there are a few misunderstandings that are out there. First of all, the Canadian entitlement, we receive it as electricity at the border, and we sell it, BC sells it, it goes to BC at market prices to either BC Hydro or utilities in the United States, and the revenue goes to the general revenue for the province and is used to provide services across British Columbia, but also is shared with the Canadian First Nations in the Columbia Basin. As Hub mentioned, you know, the calculation of the Canadian entitlement up to today has become more and more difficult, because I remember one of the people who had the pen on this, Gordon McNabb, he passed away a few years, but you know, he said we were tasked in the 1960s to make assumptions on what the power generation or power system would look like in the Pacific Northwest in 60 years. And he said, we made assumptions. And I said, oh, how did you do? And he said, we got every one wrong. So it means that really how it's determined no longer, that was written in the 60s, no longer has any relevance, frankly, to the system today. But it was always predicted to go down, and you can see the logic in a way behind that, because as there are more renewables coming on, the growth, load growth is accelerating, the proportional assistance lift of the Columbia Treaty generation becomes less and less when you look at all these other factors. So we, in BC, we recognize that the initial period is significantly lower for the Canadian entitlement, but it provides us with certainty over the longer term, which overall we feel is a fair balance and also is a win-win, as Hub described. The other thing I want to mention is the importance of the 1,120 megawatt transmission south to north. That really allows BC to import power when it's economic to do so, and that relieves pressure on our reservoirs for our power generation, especially to meet load in cold winters, which they say it's going to be a La Nina winter. We're really hoping for a lot of snow after 2 years of drought. And the same thing, and you know, that will provide us with energy security on our side of the border. The potential for the new transmission is also very exciting, to be able to trade clean energy back and forth will also allow the expansion of renewables as supported by hydro and benefit environmentally and otherwise both countries. So I'll just leave it at that and leave time for others. Thank you.
I just want to take a second to remind everyone you have paper and pens on each table. Make sure you write your questions down for the panelists.
Okay, so I'm going to just introduce the topic of the Canadian domestic flexibility. Since the engagement process within the basin in BC and throughout the negotiations, we've been talking about the need for more flexibility a lot. And we've spoken about how we want to have more flexibility for BC treaty operations to meet our domestic objectives. And we believe with the agreement principle that we have achieved that. The current treaty allows for power coordination for 15.5 million acre feet, but the new provision will allow us, the BC, to unilaterally reduce that to 11.5 million acre feet for the first 15 years, and then down to 10.5 million acre feet, up to 10.5 million acre feet in the subsequent 5 years. And that is almost a third of the entire treaty storage. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that we will be able to have up to 4 to 5 million acre feet to manage the reservoirs and the flows under our own terms to meet the basin interests that we've been hearing about for the last decade. And Nathan will speak to the First Nations interests. And without needing concurrence or agreement with the United States. We heard that consistently over the last 12 years or longer that we need to address environmental concerns, environmental objectives in the Modernized Treaty. Well, the acquiring of domestic flexibility is going to allow us to do that to some degree on the BC side. And you'll be hearing about how environmental values and environmental objectives and indigenous cultural values will also be addressed in other portions of the agreement principle. So on that, I would like to pass this on to my colleague, Nathan, to speak to what are we going to propose to do with that flexibility.
Glad to be here, and certainly appreciate the organization of the symposium, and I was able to attend previous ones, and very consistent in the approach in terms of talking about a more ethical approach to I guess the Columbia River system under the Columbia River Treaty. So it's yeah, good to be here. And I represent the Sahwab Nation in the negotiations. And the three nations, the Tanaka, Okanagan, and the Sahwab, we've been involved in the negotiations since 2019. We have a seat at the table on the Canadian side as part of the Canadian delegation. And we take part in all of the discussions, strategies, attend all the meetings, and have a voice. And I think that was one of the original intents, was for the First Nations to have a voice in the discussions. The other part of the voice was to bring our perspectives to the table, and we've done that, and very pleased to represent First Nations ideas. All that we're doing and attempting to do in terms of changing the treaty to more support cultural values and ecological values is very familiar territory for First Nations in terms of our worldview, our perspectives. In our language, we have words for everything. And one of the big words that we have in the Sahwab is kwant kwant. It's the obligation we have as First Nations people to be respectful to each other as people, and to respect the natural world within which we live. And so we bring that perspective, and it's certainly, when you talk about ethics, it's a big change in terms of respecting the world as having intrinsic value and having a life of its own that should be respected. So, yeah, so what do you do with flexibility? We get what we ask for. We got 4 million acre feet to fool around with. And for us, it's in this area we call specific operations. That's how do we actually put into operations 4 million acre feet to support ecological and cultural values. And so we've been doing research on that, and First Nations, we've been able to participate in that, and in some cases take the lead. So it's we've come down to the I guess looking at how we ecologically how we can improve the ecosystem, right from the microorganisms right up to the top of the food chain. Within the basin, and we're looking at riparian areas, wetlands, how we can maintain the levels of the reservoirs and the flows between the reservoirs to the advantage of the environment. We're also looking at the floodplain, the large areas that are left exposed and inundated every year, and seeing how changes in levels at different times of the year can give some advantage to animal and plant species. So lots of research in that area, and we're looking forward to the results of the current modeling that we're doing, where everything's being put into a computer and we're trying to determine what gives us the best effect. Are we going to use the full 4 million acre feet, or is it going to be less? And is it going to be 2 million for that and 1 million for that? So we're coming up to what we would call a specific operation, using a specified amount of water to deal with ecological and cultural values. On our side, we have a cultural knowledge holder group that advises us in terms of what we look toward the anticipated positive effects on cultural values, and of course a whole lot of information around ecological or provided by ecological experts. So we're just in the process of setting up that model, and we're also looking at how it affects hydroelectric production, because we understand that's important, as well as flood control. So we know that this whole piece has to work together, and we're trying to make the best result for all of the different interests in the watershed. And of course, on our side, we're committed to consulting with our First Nations folks on our side, our communities and our tribal groups. And we're really interested in bringing back the salmon. That's a topic that will be dealt with. And that, as far as an ecological piece, is important. And we're really looking forward to the day that we can have salmon back on our side of the border. And climate change, we're thinking about that. It's sort of there. And of course, that's another topic. So just glad to be here and represent some of the First Nations interests in that specific operation. How much water do we actually provide for the health of the ecological and cultural values? Thank you. Kuchjam.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to the Coutney Transboundary Collaborative Working Group with Billy Barquin and then Troy Hunter. Troy's going to go first. Troy's going to go first. See how collaborative?
I'm going to leave it to Billy to talk about some of the nuts and bolts. I like to tell stories, and so I'm going to speak in that way. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Spokane people, giving thanks for us being here on their territory. But I want to talk about the great hoop that exists, because the Coutney Transboundary Working Group, what is that? Is that there's the Coutney River that feeds into the Columbia. And why is it a part of the treaty? Because we have 4 dams, and the Coutney River has the dam on the Libby Dam. And so with that, I want to mention that we look at that area where the Libby Dam has, like from what I see it, in my perspective, it's the bow that belonged to Nashmoksen. And Nashmoksen is the person that created, the great hoop of the Columbia River and the Coutney River at the headwaters where the Tunaha reside there. And Nashmoksen is a giant in our creation story. And why I call that area the bow and the arrow of Nashmoksen is because the Coutney River starts in the Rocky Mountains, and it goes south from BC into Montana, over into Idaho, and then back up into BC. So it's shaped like a bow. But what's interesting is there's a place there called the Yak River that is in our language, ak, it means arrow. So when you look at it, it's a bow and an arrow. And then you look at the people that used to live there, the middle Coutney, they call themselves now in Kasanka that live in Elmo, the standing arrow people, that they came from that area. And so, you know, when you look at our language and break it down, it says a lot. You know, we have Upper Coutney and Lower Coutney there. And so with the Coutney Transboundary Working Group, we've got a lot of members, different government representatives, the regional government, and many folks here that are in this room that are part of that working group. And so we're able to work together to come to some ability to put in our thoughts and our words into how the dam is operated in a way to have a voice. And that's what's important, is to be heard. It's important, and as Tanaka, we're happy to be here, happy to be at this table, and happy to be, you know, able to have input into something that's happened to our land that we've never been consulted upon. So I also want to remark upon what happened in Lower Coutney in the year 1845 was a man came from down south here and went up into Yakanuki. His name was Father Desmet, and he sat with the Tunaha in probably around Crescent or Bonners Ferry, somewhere around there on the Lower Coutney part of the river, in a room much like this. If you look, this is like a ceremony or a pit house or something. Like we had one that was called a longhouse, and it was made out of teepees with the tule mats. And if you ever seen the Edward Curtis photo of the Nez Perce, the longhouse, that's what we had. That was our traditional form of government. And we were doing ceremonial work, and our people there were looking after acknowledgement, all living things. They were there to pray. They were there to take care of that first fish. They were doing a first fish ceremony there in August that year, and that was with the kokanee that was coming up. And, you know, we got landlocked salmon called kokanee, and, you know, they go up the Goat River there, and so they're looking after them, they're praying, and that was our real Indigenous way. And as for all of us, I think that, you know, as Indigenous people, we have a stewardship responsibility to look after all living things. In our language, we call that akamikapikapsin. And that's what we're doing, is that we're fulfilling the sacred covenant that was made with the Creator and with, you know, to look after the environment so it will look after us and all future generations that come. So that's why we're happy to have a seat at this Coutney Transboundary Working Group, to be able to have a voice and to fulfill our covenant, our sacred duty to be there. So I think I covered most of the stuff. There is the waterfalls are sacred to us, and the Coutney Tribe of Idaho was very valuable in preserving what's called the Coutney Falls, because they too could have been inundated by dams, but we were able to save that. And, you know, and for us, we have an annual trek to Nacha from Canada and USA. We got tribes on both sides of the border. You know, sometimes we're known as Coutney, but we're the Tunaha. We go to that Libby or the Coutney Falls, and people, you know, reflect and you know, spend their time there and give prayers and thanks. And so I think I've covered off what I wanted to say. Oh, I also wanted to mention about that great hoop of the Columbia River and the Coutney River. So the Coutney River comes down from the Rockies, from around almost at Banff area, and comes down south and comes to a place where it's called Canal Flats. That's right beside Columbia Lake. And so I want to acknowledge the words of Bill Green, who Maureen and I have, after he's retired, sort of, we worked together because he's spent 30 years working with us doing the work. But he talked about how the Columbia Lake, that's the headwaters of the Columbia River, 1/3 of the water is fed by the Coutney River. And so that's an underground aquifer that exists there. And so it totally matches with our creation story and with the science on the ground. When you look at the aerial photos, you could see that there are times when water flowed from the Coutney northwards into the Columbia. And so, our creation story talks about, how the 4 races of humans, red, yellow, black, and white, came to be at that place, and that we were put there. It's interesting, this intersection of Western science and traditional knowledge or oral histories. They seem to resonate and come together. So, that's all I wanted to say right now. Thank you.
I'm Billy Barquin. I do want to take a quick opportunity to say hello to all my friends and colleagues. I came in a little late this morning, and apologies in advance. I have a meeting at 11, so I'm going to leave a little early as well. And to all my colleagues up here on the stage as well, sorry about that. Thanks for that, Troy. One thing we do in the Coutney really well is collaborate. Coutney Tribe of Idaho, Akankami-Tunaha. We work on Coutney River white sturgeon and burbot restoration. We work in collaboration with the U.S., Canada, BC, Idaho, Montana, our sister governments in the Tunaha Nation. But what we have discovered is we collaborate really well on the lower Coutney. They collaborate really well on the upper Coutney. But we didn't generally come together and collaborate as a whole. And it's one basin, the Coutney Basin. It's one basin, the Columbia Basin, is one basin, the Coutney Basin. I think I'm supposed to say sub-basin since I'm up here for the treaty, but I'll continue to say basin. So what we did is we gathered a bunch of the governments in the territory, in Tunaha territory, for these meetings. We tried hosting the first one at Akankami, and Kathy, God bless her, she flew into Cranbrook and almost white-knuckled it down, but the blizzard decided, no, we're all gonna go virtual. But we all came together to say, what do we in this territory, in this Coutney Basin, have in common? And when we filled out the list, it was pretty much, what's in common, what's not in common, and pretty much everything was in common. We work well together. So what we thought is this working group will help bring us all together, both Upper Coutney and Lower Coutney, to look at everything. So, too often Libby Dam has been either the source of all evil or the solution to all evil when it's just a dam. Yes, it had a huge impact on the territory, but so did other things like the removal of the floodplain. So the Coutney Transboundary Collaborative Work Group, the geographic scope includes, and it's going to be a long-term collaborative process that facilitates transboundary communication, cooperation, coordination, and collaboration, 4 C's there, and provides a forum for us to share, exchange, and collaborate on scientific information, including our Indigenous knowledge. But the geographic scope includes Koocanusa Reservoir and its tributaries, including upstream Coutney River to the confluence of the White River and upstream tributaries, with identified interactions with Koocanusa Reservoir, and then downstream Coutney River and Coutney Lake, and to include a process to gain a broader understanding and engagement on Duncan Dam Reservoir and Coeur d'Alene Dam operations. And so really the purpose is, let's bring all of us together, get us in one room, and as we look at what each of us are trying to accomplish, for example, at Akankami-Tunaha, at Coutney Tribe of Idaho, we're trying to restore Coutney River and white sturgeon. That includes VERQ operations and the sturgeon operations in order to provide the water flows. It includes habitat restoration, both on the US side and on the BC side. It includes just a whole bunch of things we want to do. Can we accomplish that just by modifying Libby Dam operations? No. Can we accomplish it just alone as Coutney Tribe of Idaho? No. But if we bring everyone together, we can say, hey, what if you did this? What would be the impact on what we're trying to do here? And that's really what the Coutney Transboundary Collaborative Work Group is intended to accomplish. Bring us all together, let us talk about the issues, let us compare science, let us learn from one another, and then let us assist one another in accomplishing what we need. And not just, I focus on ecosystem and Indigenous, Tunaha values, but our subject scope includes the ecosystem, Indigenous cultural values, power, I should know these without having to look at a list, but flood risk management, recreation, and socioeconomic issues. It's going to include proactive government coordination, so all the governments in the territory coming together. It'll be co-chaired by the US, Canada, including BC, and the Ktunaxa Nation. It'll include representatives from all the governments. And so part of it will be we as governments working together. But the other important part that the folks who developed the working group sort of principles or report was to also have a public facing. So we're going to ensure that what we're doing in our working group, that not only do we provide that information to the public, but we also receive input from the public. I work in government. I've worked in government my entire 25 career. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. But I don't know everything, and I don't think any of us in government do, so it's important that we hear from our citizens, and that includes for us all citizens in Ktunaxa territory. Takas.
Okay, we'll now hear about the Joint Ecosystem and Indigenous and Tribal Cultural Values Body, starting with Jay Johnson, Maureen DeHaan, and then Michael Tehan.
Why, Lim, thanks everybody. I won't keep my remarks very long, or I'll try not to. Those of you that know me, that's always a challenge. But I'm really, as I said this morning, I'm really proud and honored to be part of this group and you know, such a collaborative and hardworking group. And yes, we had some very, very difficult issues from time to time, regularly, but we always found a way to keep the dialogue going and find creative solutions. And something that's super important to the opportunity to renew or modernize the new treaty is looking back at what the problems were with the old treaty. We obviously had a treaty that was focused primarily on, well, exclusively on flood control and power generation, and reflected kind of the era of the day in the 60s. And, you know, we build it, we'll conquer nature, we'll make a better world for everyone. And left out the ecosystem, left out the communities along the river, left out Indigenous voices, left out salmon, left out the impacts to everyday species that don't have a voice. And we needed to find a way to rectify that, to monitor it, to ensure that the operation of the treaty will, in fact, be a better way, a better process. And so, building on a lot of the work that we had done in discussions with our communities, with discussions with the public, working with the University Consortium going back to when the 2000s had single digits, we borrowed from a lot of those conversations and a lot of the thoughts and tried to weave in and build a system that can include ecosystems on an ongoing basis, not just to sort of assume that we knew the right thing to do, add it, and walk away. This is an active river system that is highly variable. We're now confronted with this potential catastrophe of climate change, and we need to be adaptive, and we need to monitor it, and we need to be able to ensure that we have space for communities to have a voice, and ensure that Indigenous nations can also have a voice, and lead a conversation about how, on an ongoing basis, we may or may not have to adapt the operations. And so the Joint Ecosystem Body and Cultural Values Body was devised for precisely that reason. And it's innovative, it's new, it's something that we're still working on the details of building. And it's really aimed at ensuring that cultural values and ecosystems are included within the treaty and within the operations. And we have the space to study things. And if we find that there's a new impact that we weren't expecting, we have a venue to make recommendations to operations. And we can do that in a very public way that includes a dialogue between operators and government and the public and Indigenous nations, tribal groups, and First Nations, so that we can come up with solutions on an ongoing basis. And so that's really important, given that the original treaty didn't include those things. And in the 60s, there were tribal groups and First Nations in Canada that came to the river after the first year of implementation looking for their salmon, looking for their food sources, and having impacts that way. So tremendous opportunity, and I guess hopefully we're learning from the past to know that we have to build it as we go. So, Lim. Oh, sorry, Maureen's going to give you the details. I'm just...
Thanks, Jay. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the framework around the Joint Ecosystem and Indigenous Cultural Values Body. It's quite a mouthful. We affectionately call it the JEB, so you'll hear that mentioned a few times. As Jay noted, it is a brand new body under the treaty and will give First Nations and tribal groups finally a voice in decision-making around how operations will be implemented. It's intended to make recommendations on how the hydro system operations may be changed to better support both ecosystem and Indigenous and tribal cultural values. We've actually embedded in the AIP the One River approach, which you're going to hear more about from our keynote speaker tonight. And this reflects the sacred duty to improve ecosystem health for all living things from the Columbia River's headwaters to the estuary of the Pacific Ocean. The JEB is what we like to call also the third leg of the stool. We've had power and flood control for some time. We now have a third leg to that stool to support the ecosystem function and Indigenous cultural values. A major accomplishment from the First Nations and tribes perspective in this negotiation. It will be unique in that it will be led and co-chaired by First Nations and U.S. tribes. There will be equal representation from the First Nations and tribes and between the United States and Canada, which includes BC representation. There will be interaction, as has been mentioned a number of times, with additional stakeholders and other transboundary groups. So it is intended to be inclusive. And we'll also be collaborating with the Coutney Transboundary Working Group. It is an entire basin, as that map points out. And we need to make sure that our discussions, our exchanges of information, our recommendations are compatible across the basin and in the best interests of the entire basin. Recommendations are expected to be made by consensus between the First Nations and the tribes. And Canadian and U.S. representatives will participate in the discussions and the work plan development. The decisions will be made by First Nations and tribal reps. The recommendations are intended to be provided to the parties, the entities, agencies of the province or the state to inform their decision-making on operations. So those conclusions or recommendations from this body will be provided to the various groups that have responsibility for the operations of the dams. And those recommendations are expected to be implemented to the best of the agencies and parties' abilities, and if they are not able to implement, then they must provide rationale for why they are not able to do that. A key component of the JEB work plan, and it's been referenced here, is an adaptive management program. We get that this is a little bit of an experiment. This is the first time round in terms of this body and the collaboration and cooperation that's going on. And we need to be able to monitor, are the things that we're doing actually having the benefits that we anticipate from an ecosystem and cultural values perspective, and to be able to adapt operations if needed or change operations as needed to try and maximize the benefits for that third leg of the stool. And those changes that are identified by the Adaptive Management Program will be used to trigger the recommendations by the JEB. It is very much a collaborative group, and it's not intended to duplicate the existing monitoring programs in the basin, but rather utilize existing information, identify data gaps, and provide a coordination of efforts across a whole range of groups that are already operating in the basin for ecosystem benefits and cultural value benefits. And you're going to hear some more about that in some of the other panels this afternoon and tomorrow. In addition, the adaptive management, the JEB will provide a forum for transboundary coordination and cooperation on salmon reintroduction and fish flow augmentation operations, which my fellow panelists will be speaking to next. So I will pass it off to Billy.
All right, let's look at Marine. Don't have much to add to what Jay and Marine just said. I guess one of the things is, while it is going to be Indigenous-led, we expect the US, Canada, and BC to be there with us, because we expect our recommendations to be, you know, an iterative process. It's not like we sit in one room and say, we think this is what should happen, and we lob it over to the US, Canada, and BC and say, do that, and they can say yes or no. But it's more they're in the rooms, and as we're trying to accomplish something, we can work with them to identify, well, okay, you can't do it that way, but if you tried a different way, we could actually accomplish what you want, so can we modify the recommendation accordingly? And the only other thing I would mention is there will be a public-facing part of this as well, so we make sure, same with the KTCW, we will get a Coutney Transboundary Collaborative Work Group. We will provide information to citizens in the basin, and we expect input from citizens in the basin. And then I'll just end with, we do call it the JEB. I was a bit overruled. I thought JEITCVB really rolled off the tongue, but folks said no to that, surprisingly. Thanks.
I don't have any more comments about the JEB, but is it okay to launch into the in-stream flow issues?
Absolutely. So the next thing will be salmon flow augmentation. Michael Tehan.
Thank you, Barb. Yeah, I'm Michael Tehan. I work with NOAA Fisheries. I've had the pleasure and honor to work on salmon recovery in the Columbia Basin for about 30 years. And Troy, I just want to say thank you so much for mentioning Bill Green. The room feels a little bit emptier without Bill here today, and it was a real honor to work with him throughout, you know, the initial points of the negotiation, and to be out there looking, you know, at Canal Flats back when we were at the Kimberley conference. So anyway, just wanted to acknowledge that. And I guess before I jump in, two things. We've got kind of two terms of art that I just wanted to briefly speak to. One is ecosystems and ecosystem-based function. And just to acknowledge that when we started these negotiations, both countries came to the table with a mandate to do something to the ecosystem and ecosystem-based function. And we quickly learned that those terms mean a lot of different things to different people. And I would say we spent the first 4 or 5 or 6 even sessions, you know, in large part hearing from Indigenous nations and U.S. tribes, our U.S. tribal observers from upriver and downriver, on what it means to them, hearing about their river vision, hearing about all the work that's they've accomplished and are continuing to do so in the basin. And that really helped us develop kind of a common understanding of ecosystem, and in particular the role of salmon in the ecosystem and the importance of flows from Columbia River Treaty operations, you know, for the salmon component of the ecosystem. The other one is just flow augmentation. It's kind of a wonky, again, term of art, and I've had many people ask me what the heck that means. And I think in order to understand it, you really have to go back and look at the salmon life cycle. Pacific salmon, as many people know, spend half their life in the ocean, half the life in fresh water. And so once their eggs hatch and the young salmon, the fry, the par, the smolts, need to go out to the ocean to complete their life cycle, they've evolved over time to follow the spring runoff, the snowmelt runoff, the freshet, out to the ocean. And before we had dams on the system, if you look at the hydrograph, you know, that was a tremendous spike of flows that the fish were able to use. And it wasn't just reducing the travel time and reducing their energy. There's a whole host of ecological functions that spring freshet filled. You know, making the floodplains interact with the river, where fish can, you know, find bugs to eat and take, you know, refuge from the high water. Providing a quick entry into the ocean so that the fish aren't exposed to higher water temperatures. The turbidity in the water that helped protect fish from predators, from birds and predatory fish during the migration period. You know, those are all ecological functions of that spring freshet that was significantly affected when we built the storage dams. Now that we've got these major big storage dams on the river. That spring freshet is captured, behind the dams to protect people and property from flooding. And it's released later in the summer, in many cases for power. And it really changes both the volume, the magnitude of the flows, and the timing that the fish experience. So kind of a management tool, a water management tool that we use to address that is flow augmentation. So we store water during the wintertime behind our storage reservoirs, and storage is limited, so we can't really recreate what was there naturally, but we can store enough water to make a difference. And when the fish need it in the spring, we release it to start providing some of those historical functions. So anyway, that's kind of the background of flow augmentation. So kind of go back into the treaty world. Even before, everyone knows now, we've heard it, that the original treaty, the treaty we're operating now, doesn't have ecosystem as a component. And so because of all this grounding work that we did on ecosystem, it became clear that we wanted to emulate that and to put some of that into practice. So if you think back to when the United States first listed salmon and steelhead as an endangered species, back in the early 90s, the U.S. has sought flow augmentation from Canadian treaty reservoirs on a voluntary basis, a cooperative basis. And we've done that through these annual supplemental agreements that are negotiated each year that provide about 1 million acre-feet a year when we can. And also in drier years provide another 500,000 acre-feet through non-treaty storage agreements that are negotiated between BC Hydro and BPA. But in this new arrangement, Canada's agreed to provide 1 million acre-feet every year for salmon flow augmentation, and to also provide that 500,000 acre-feet for the drier years through long-term enabling agreements. And this is, I think, the most significant piece of this. We weren't able to secure higher volumes of water for the flow augmentation, but for those similar volumes that we have today, having that built into the treaty language and having a long-term agreement, so we're not having to do annual negotiations. It's something that's built into the treaty planning. It's going to significantly, I think, improve the opportunities for securing flow augmentation for salmon every year. And I think also having the treaty text feeds into that third leg of the stool. It really acknowledges that both countries see the value and the importance of flow augmentation for their salmon recovery and restoration efforts. And then just one last thing I did want to mention is that by agreeing to pursue this pre-planned flood control volumes and to continue with power coordination, the United States can avoid the impacts that would accrue if we had to reoperate our system to provide flow augmentation. We already provide about 4 million acre-feet from U.S. reservoirs. But the impacts would be much greater if we didn't have those other components. So like you've heard many of the panelists say, all these different pieces work together and to provide that outcome. So anyway, that's a quick snapshot on flow augmentation, and I'm not sure who I'm passing it over to next.
Jay.
All right, thanks, Jay.
Lim, thanks very much. Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than we're really pleased that we've got some permanency around fish flow augmentation for salmon. From our perspective, we've added an additional 0.5 million acre-feet for dry water years, which is dedicated and really, really important. And I think from First Nations perspective, from tribal perspective, we're really pleased that when we add these things together, we've got the additional specified operations in Canada on the domestic side to enhance ecosystems and provide a whole range of benefits on the Canadian side, potentially downstream into the United States as well. From securing that volume of water, we now have dedicated fish flow augmentation with some permanency. We've added 0.5 million acre-feet to the dry water years when needed, when we measure at the Dalles annually. And we have the JEP, the Joint Ecosystem Cultural Value, Indigenous Cultural Values body. And that will include not just in First Nations and tribal voice, but also basin-wide public input and participation into the treaty, into the operations. And we've added adaptive management, which is an ethic that will continue to roll as the treaty is implemented over time. And so lots of work to do still. And then I guess the thing that I would say about the process is Steve has been very kind to talk about how important it is for Indigenous voices to be at the table, but it's actually quite monumental. And it's no small feat. Both governments leaned very forward to ensure that Indigenous voices on both sides of the border were included formally as observers, but behind the scenes working hard to ensure that the voices and the values were represented as best we could do. And I think, as far as I'm aware, that's the first time in the contemporary world where Indigenous voices are at the table in an international agreement. So this is like serious stuff. So lim. Salmon introduction.
Finally, we're going to go to Salmon introduction, and that will be Roland and Troy. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you. Roland Springer with Bureau of Reclamation. We manage Grand Coulee Dam, which is the largest reservoir on the U.S. side of the system. And of course, Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph, which is downstream, managed by the Corps of Engineers, those blocked salmon passage many years ago. As I start out, though, I would just like to mention how wonderful it's been to work on this treaty team. I joined the team about 3 years ago. There are many people here that are much senior to me, but just the connections I've made with folks on the U.S. side, but then with our Canadian counterparts as we've traveled to different locations for negotiation sessions and just had a chance to build those personal and professional relationships. I have really treasured the time that I've been able to get to know all the folks on this team and the many others who sat in the rooms with us in the negotiation sessions. During negotiations to modernize the treaty, we did hear, as many of the speakers have mentioned, we've heard a lot from the tribes and Indigenous nations and learned about the profound loss that they've experienced with the system of dams that is now in place, and that they continue to experience those losses. And those losses are on both sides of the border. So as we negotiated, we talked a lot about the reintroduction element. The agreement in principle did include a commitment for both countries to respect and address the needs of reintroduction within the modernized treaty regime, taking into account the one river approach, which we've already mentioned. And as we thought about reintroduction, we heard about the efforts of the Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Initiative on the Canadian side of the border, and the Phase 2 implementation plan led by the Upper Columbia United Tribes on the U.S. side of the border. And we had chances to go and see the salmon release, the smolt release is one up in Canada in Kelowna on Mission Creek, hosted by the Silks Okanagan, and then also separately, I've been able to just recently see a smolt release on the Spokane River by the Spokane Tribe of Indians, and just I recognize I'm an outsider, I'm a settler, but that spiritual connection to the salmon is so strong, and I could feel it there, and I could feel the importance. And I can only imagine the great meaning that it has to our Indigenous brethren and the people we work with here. So the AIP does have commitments to collaborate and cooperate on salmon reintroduction efforts on both sides of the border, including using recommendations that come out of the JEB, which has been mentioned. One of the commitments in the agreement in principle is that the JEB will review the results of reintroduction studies and activities at least every 5 years and make recommendations to the countries. And again, I think that leads to the strength and the potential of that JEB, and I look forward to those efforts. I will turn a little bit to what's happening on the U.S. side of the border with the Phase 2 implementation plan. I know there is a panel on reintroduction tomorrow, but just from the federal side, just a few things I'd like to mention. This Phase 2 implementation plan has been led by the Upper Columbia United Tribe members, the Colville, Spokane, and Coeur d'Alene tribes. You know, these are strategies for studying and figuring out how to reintroduce salmon above Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams, including both Chinook and Sockeye. And then, so that would reintroduce them into the Columbia River as well as the Spokane River, where we have private dams that also block the passage there. And that has been in place for, you know, those have been in place for decades. In September of 2023, the U.S. agencies signed an agreement with these tribes to support reintroduction studies and this Phase 2 implementation plan. I recognize that this agreement was the result of many, many years of work and effort and advocacy by the tribes, stressing the importance of this. And it's just so exciting that we now do have a 20-year research program that will prove out concepts and understand fish behavior and hopefully lead us to that passage that is so important, both within the US and Canada. Many of the agencies that signed on to that are here in the room with us today: the Corps of Engineers, Bonneville Power Administration, NOAA, and Department of Interior with Bureau of Reclamation. And we have a host of other agencies that are also participating in that effort. Washington Department of Ecology, Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, Pacific Northwest National Labs, and Douglas County Public Utility District. So this is I'll say it's the starting of a monumental effort on the U.S. side that I hope we will see the benefits within the U.S. as well as Canada, and increased coordination on the Canadian efforts as well as the U.S. efforts over the next 20 years. A couple of key elements that relate to this are the commitment of the U.S. agencies to support this effort. Bonneville Power Administration committed to $200 million of funding over that 20-year lifespan. And other agencies have committed to seek appropriations, and between our Reclamation, NOAA, other agencies, we've already provided over $10 million to that, and have a lot of agency efforts that are supporting that with internal funding, as well as funding that has been awarded to the tribes. We're offering technical assistance, surplus hatchery eggs, and I will say one of the things at Reclamation that our engineers are very excited about is design concepts for passage over Grand Coulee Dam. You know, it's a relatively high head dam, lots of technical challenges, but I tell you, our folks in Denver at our Technical Services Center are super jazzed about the opportunity to work on a challenging problem and hopefully get some great results to support the salmon. We are doing regulatory efforts to support this. Right now there's NEPA compliance, and that I would like to announce that the programmatic environmental assessment hit the street today. So you should be able to find that if you're interested in looking at that. That's available to the public. I Googled P2IP programmatic environmental assessment, and I found it. Hopefully your Google works the same as mine. So again, just it's super exciting to see some adult returns already happening, and just initial successes with reintroduction, and hopefully through continued cooperation and work of the JEB, we will be able to see many more successes on that.
There's a saying in my language, and it means my heart is happy. Okanagan. You know, to be able to hear these words of we're doing the work of bringing salmon home, that it's so important for us. You know, 86 years have passed since salmon have been able to get over that Grand Coulee Dam. And that's how long it is as Tonaha that we have not had salmon. And that's impacted our diet. You know, half of our diet was likely salmon. It's impacted our economics. You know, we used to trade. We used to bring that salmon to the prairies and play games with the the folks over there in Gamble, that was the big thing that brought our Indigenous nations together. You heard about Salilo Falls and Kettle Falls. Those were places of gathering where our peoples gathered. And salmon was always there. It was ubiquitous. It was something that we could rely on. It was our food, our staple. It was something that was always there. And we had ceremonies and prayer, and all these things took place. And, you know, we didn't think back then that there would ever be a loss like that has impacted. And it impacts the environment as well for all the nutrients that just goes and feeds what we call all living things. I am very happy to know we have in Canada what's called the Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Initiative. And that this is something that has been going on for a while now. And we have actual evidence that it's working. The Okanagan now has massive returns of salmon. At one time, I believe it was the Chief Joseph Dam that has blocked the passage. But with the work that the folks are doing there, they're bringing salmon back. There's cans of salmon I hear that are here from that very same that have been able to come back now. And that's what we hope, and that's what we want all the way, if we can, to the headwaters of the Columbia River. You know, there used to be these June hogs, these massive 80-pound salmon, Chinook salmon that would come up, and, you know, those are great losses. As we go into this time of climate change, food security is number one. You know, we have to look after that. If we don't look after the water, if we don't look after the fish, then what will we live on? And so that's why I said my heart is happy to hear these words that we're doing the work. And I know that the Columbia River Treaty did not block the salmon, but to be able to include it in whatever way we can in this negotiations, in this treaty, is a major milestone for all of us. And, you know, I feel a pride to be in this room, this historic time that we're talking about. We're trying to fix something here and bringing the salmon home. So I just want to say thank you. My heart is happy. Hey.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really want to take this opportunity to thank all of the members of the negotiating teams for being here and taking all this time to talk to us. We're going to go directly to question and answers, and if you're still writing them down, just hold them up and someone will come around and get them. We only have, we'll have 35 minutes of questions, and then we will go to a break. If we don't get to your question, we will provide those to the negotiating teams. Before I go to that, I should give an opportunity for Steve and Jill to make any concluding remarks, if you'd like to. Nope, go straight to questions. Okay, I'm going to go in reverse order, so we'll start with salmon reintroduction. The first question is, will the AIP include sending a pulse or two for salmon, sturgeon, lamprey passage from Canada to the ocean and back? Is the amount of 1.5 million acre feet enough? Who would like to take that? Everyone's looking at you, Michael.
Apparently so. Well, as far as a pulse, I think we have a fairly well-developed infrastructure of salmon managers who monitor flows and fish migration every year and try to make our best professional guesses about when is the appropriate time to release flows from different projects to aid, salmon migration. It differs every year depending on, what kind of a water forecast it is, what the timing of the fish runs are, those kind of things. Is 1 to 1.5 enough? I would say, as I mentioned earlier, it's a fraction of what the natural freshet was, but it's also combined with 3 to 5 million acre feet from U.S. projects. And even in the U.S., there's a few projects like Dorshak Dam that can actually cool the water. So all those factors go into providing the best that we're able to. It's really the volume of storage that's limiting our ability to provide more.
Thank you. This next question is addressed to both teams to answer, and this is moving to salmon flow augmentation. What is the understanding and expectation on the part of the U.S. on how it manages water when Canada sends salmon flows across the border to benefit river health, salmon recovery, and ecological values? So I think that's asking, once the flow is sent across the border, how is the U.S. going to manage that flow?
Well, I can start, then I can turn to my colleagues. We're fortunate to have space in Grand Coulee Dam that can capture flow augmentation releases from the Canadian reservoirs and store it temporarily until the fish managers say they need it. So, there's and part of the agreement, the provisions of the agreement are that on an annual basis, the U.S. will report back to both countries and to the JEB on specifically how the Canadian flows from treaty reservoirs were complemented and used in conjunction with the U.S. flows. So there's going to be an accounting. And I know there's always been some fears that how do we know that flow is actually going to go to fish? And that's a big part of the agreement, is to try to provide that documentation. Because it gets really complex with water coming down the Snake, water coming from different tributaries, different places, and so yeah, we will need to provide that accounting.
Does anyone else want to speak to that from the Canadians? Jay?
Yeah, just to round the Canadian circle, I guess, but not too much more to add to that other than as you mentioned, the JEB will be looking into that and monitoring it to make sure that that process of the fish flow augmentation is flowing at the right time of the year and so forth. One of the things that's also probably worth mentioning is that the timing of the fish flow augmentation, right? Like we've got a larger window for that now, from I believe May 1st to August 7th, and so that allows some flexibility with potential seasonal variabilities and water flow, et cetera. So all of those will be looked at and accounting on both sides of the border. So that's the first, right?
And also, it's worth mentioning, Nathan talked earlier about the specified operations. As Canada decides how they want to use the specified operations, there could be benefits to salmon and steelhead migration as well, depending on how Arrow Lakes is operated, depending on when releases are made for Canadian resident fish. And so that's a big part of the role of the JEB, is looking in the future about how the different fish operations interact with one another, because there could be additional benefits that we haven't accounted for.
Okay, thank you. The next one goes to both the Coutney Transboundary Collaborative Working Group and the JEB. Might those two organizations become permanent transboundary committees, and who will provide the funding? Who would like to speak to that?
Yes, they will become permanent. They're going to be part of the treaty regime. Both the Coutney Transboundary Collaborative Work Group and the Joint Ecosystem and Indigenous Tribal Cultural Values Body. As far as funding and how that's going to work, it's to be determined. There's a lot of details in both to be ironed out. We are at the AIP stage, and so we'll figure that out. But yeah, in our opinion, it's going to be there forever.
And who's going to fund it?
Still working it out, right.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add?
Oh, yeah.
There is discussion in the AIP about what might be appropriate funding. And as Billy mentioned, there's still a lot of work to do to sort out both the JEB and the Coutney working group. And that's one of the tasks that is still need to be done is developing a work plan and the appropriate funding to support those groups, which will then go back to governments for consideration.
Thank you. Okay, this is continuing along that line. The Coutney Working Group seems to include the full range of interests, but the JEB doesn't. Is this intentional?
Yeah, because they have different functions. The Joint Ecosystem and Indigenous and Tribal Cultural Values body, this is why we call it the JEB. It's intended to bring in ecosystem and our tribal and cultural values. And so it's very specific in that respect. The Coutney Transboundary Collaborative Work Group is a lot broader. It's not, while it is Indigenous-led in the fact that it's co-chaired by the Ktunaxa Nation, it's also co-chaired by the US and by Canada, including BC. And it's a much broader scope for the KTCW to look at a range of issues that are affecting the Coutney, but especially to unite Upper and Lower Coutney as we're discussing issues. That helps.
Thanks, Billy. I don't want to leave people with the impression that the JEB is just about the salmon reintroduction and the flow augmentation. It's not limited to just those things. Again, we're still in the process of defining the scope of what the JEB will look at. It is an ecosystem view. How much that we consider will be part of the discussion on the scope of the JEB and the JEB terms of reference. It's not, again, intended to be limiting. It's about what is the priority with respect to the JEB and its tasks in trying to find the best benefits for the ecosystem as a whole and Indigenous cultural values. So it's not like we won't be considering those other things, it's just a function of what's the priority.
Okay, this is continuing on the process of working with a broader group of people. The AIP has advisory processes in the Coutney for Indigenous people, and many of us are interested in basin-wide participation. Why is it so limited in the AIP, and is there a way to broaden the participatory process? Who would like to? Jill.
Thank you. So we're working against the clock in some ways to kind of put these major pieces together, especially things that we have determined need to go into a Synod advice and consent document. And as Billy said, the Coutney Transboundary Working Group was developed a little differently. And we both have a lot of outreach processes on both sides of the border. We just haven't worked to think through how do we make treaty operations more transparent and that sort of thing. And I don't think that that needs to necessarily go into a Synod advice and consent document. There are work we can do as agencies and working with people to determine how do we get to that in the future, but with the deadline happening in September of flood control and us hitting against some of these challenges with the power operations and needing to really pull these critical elements of ecosystem together, we just got to a point where we couldn't put everything in there, and we saw kind of the outreach and engagement as something that, at least for the US side, that we could continue working on as we're putting these important building blocks into place.
Yeah, for BC, we've been engaging with communities and the CRT Local Government Committee since 2012. First, to decide whether we should continue the treaty, terminate it, or amend it, and improve upon it, which we have made that decision. And then since then, since 2014, we've been working hard and continuing throughout the entire years until, and including when we're starting negotiations with the U.S. to reach out to basin residents, to communities, on what they would like to see in a modernized treaty. And we publish newsletters, we get feedback in a continuous way throughout all of those years. And we continue to do that. We've had our virtual meeting on the AIP. We are going to continue to seek feedback from local government committee and community, basin communities. In an ongoing basis, I think we believe humbly that we have a good sense of what people are looking for, and we are hoping that we believe that it's reflected in the AIP. The details aren't there, and it requires more explanation. Including, you know, we were here the last few summers, and including this summer, last summer was even worse, on the socioeconomic impacts of the Columbia River Treaty and how could we use potentially the new flexibility to be able to address some of these other concerns. And that will be part of another engagement process once we close in on what a specified operation will look like. So it's, for us, it's nonstop, and I could assure everybody that basin residents aren't shy about giving their opinion to government and what they would like to see.
Did you? Okay. Okay, the West Coutney, BC residents are very concerned about the historic low levels in the Arrow Lakes and associated fish mortality. How will the renegotiated treaty impact Arrow Lakes levels? What's it going to look like?
Continuing on that theme, yeah, these last 2 years have been very, very, very tough. To the extent that we hadn't seen very often in the last couple of decades. And so we are looking at, in the modeling of the specified operation, different reservoir elevations, different fluctuation amplitudes to see how we could potentially minimize impacts in the Arrow Lakes Reservoir.
Okay, this is a question for U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Pete. Approximately how frequently do you expect called upon FRM will be needed? Just a simple
good
prediction.
So, as Kathy mentioned, I didn't get into the details, but you know, the existing treaty, and this is actually a part of the treaty that cannot be terminated. If the treaty as a whole is terminated, you know, when the decision was made to sign the original treaty and when it entered into force, part of the record was that the U.S. was saying, hey, we're making this investment and this infrastructure investment in the treaty and infrastructure in Canada as opposed to the U.S. for our long-term economic development, and so we need a, you know, evergreen type right to access storage in Canada if needed. It wasn't sure if it would be needed at this time because there were plans to build a lot more dams actually in the United States that were never built. And part of the reason they were never built is because the economics changed when the Columbia River Treaty was signed and executed. And so that right, you know, for as long as, I like to say, as long as the dams exist in Canada and water flows downhill, the U.S. will have the right to call Canada when it cannot control flooding with related facilities in the United States. And so the probability of that is very much unknown. It's due to a lot of things. The biggest one is Mother Nature and hydrology. How much water, how much snow, how much rain is going to come into the basin. Number two, very close number two is how Canada chooses to operate. It's not just the exact terms in the AIP or the plans that they have at the beginning of the year, but it's just sort of with there's a lot of discretion today, and we've talked a lot about the additional discretion and flexibility that Canada is going to have in the future. There's some very good environmental ecosystem-based operations that will minimize the need to make those calls, like a stable arrow, a stable reservoir type operation provides a lot of opportunity for flood control for those years when you do need to have more space than what would happen in a normal year. And so those types of variabilities make it pretty difficult actually to predict, and it's something that we're not speculating on right now. Our goal is to get the interim arrangements done very, very soon, then get the Modernized Treaty entered into force, and then as Kathy said, we have made a commitment in the AIP to sit down and talk about that. And hopefully we're able to sit down and talk about it before we actually have to pick up the phone and make that call. That's our goal. But if not, if this year or next year we do have some big event, then it will be, I don't know what probability, we'll probably explain that after the fact. But that will happen, and that will be again part of our message in those real-time FRM briefings in early December.
Thank you. This one goes to the power production and Canadian entitlement, I believe. If the assumptions made in the 1960s proved wrong, what are the basis of the assumptions for the Modernized Treaty? Who would like to answer that?
Kathy, do you want me to go start? I'll start. Yeah. So the hard part on the entitlement and the power operations is the results of the entitlement it really depends on the inputs and assumptions you make, on how the hydro system is going to be operated, things like, not trying to get too wonky on this, but planning reserve margins, when hydro maintenance occurs, the amount of load growth regionally, and what you expect that's going to be. When you're doing, so under the treaty, it requires, the way it is now, that you do your plans and projections 6 years out. So you're not basing it on of-the-moment reality. I'm hesitating to say the word speculating, but there is an element of that built into it. And that was the approach that was set up in the 60s because for maybe some reasons I don't even fully understand, but back then there was a lot more ability to project out on those things. They could actually, it was very hydrocentric, as we talked about, flood control and hydro, right? That's it. That's not true today, and you have so much more variability. So really what we were looking at, again, I think I touched on this a little bit with the different inputs and assumptions that I mentioned in my presentation, is a potential broad bandwidth of outcomes of what the entitlement could end up being depending on different perspectives of what the inputs and assumptions would be. So where we landed, I believe, was in the middle of that bandwidth, and again, kind of reflects kind of how we both value the hydro system today from a power perspective. So maybe not the most direct or a complete answer on that, but that's about the best I can provide on that. I don't know, Kathy, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I just have to agree that trying to determine the Canadian entitlement based on the formulation, the steps to determine the defined downstream power benefits with an archaic, no longer relevant set of assumptions and processes is like trying to stuff a square peg in a round hole. And depending on how big your peg is and our peg is and your hole is and our hole is, we could coming up with fairly divergent, there was a big gap. And there's no way really in using the existing way to determine the Canadian entitlement to narrow that gap or to resolve that gap, because it's using formula that just doesn't work anymore. So I think we believe that it's a compromise and a balance between the views of both countries on the Canadian entitlement that serves both well.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more. A couple of them asked basically this question: why is ecosystem function not expressly included as we talk about it as a third prong, but it isn't expressly included in the AIP as co-equal in priority with power production and flood risk management? Why is that? Or is it? I guess should be the other way to ask that question.
Well, I think it is, in the sense that, I mean, maybe we don't say it in, like, we're not saying, I mean, there's nothing in the AIP that says third leg of the stool or fourth leg of the chair or anything like that, but I think how we've laid it out, including a lot of huge sections that are dedicated to the JEB, the specified operation, the Coutney board, the Salmon stuff and all that, I think it's very much in there. And also just, I mean, I want to remind everybody again that the AIP sort of lays out our understandings that we've come together on what should go into a modernized treaty. Our task now is to create that modernized treaty. So I very much think that the idea of ecosystems is very much, and we've talked about adaptive management and so on, is all in the AIP, and that will be guiding the drafting of the treaty.
I just want to add that we are talking about to add to the preamble of the modernized treaty to reflect today's realities, including the ecosystems and including the need for adaptive management and climate change. So that, you know, the AIP is a skeleton, and now we're just putting the flesh on the bones, and it will come out more in the drafting.
Yes, in the IAP, we have up to 4 million acre feet to use for ecosystem health, and that's a bit optional on our part. We'll decide on how much that is at some point. That's built right into the AIP in hard numbers. We can use up to 4 million acre feet for that specific purpose, mainly for ecological health. So I would say, yeah, it's built into the AIP, which is the last step into the treaty. Thanks.
Well, I think our time is up. I want to just summarize. There were a couple of comments that basically said this: thank you all for your service over the years of negotiating this. There was expressed a lot of appreciation from the crowd. So. We're going to take a 15-minute break. For those of you whose questions we did not get to, I will provide those to the negotiators, and we'll talk about a way that we can get responses back to people. So, thank you. Please exit that way so you can get your questions. Thank you. Hear me now? Well, thank you. There will be other moderators in the future. You won't be stuck with me the whole time. So again, I'm Barb Cousins. I work with Universities Consortium on Columbia River governance. What this panel is it's made up of representatives of Indigenous organizations, local governments, youth, environmental NGOs, and one climate scientist. And it will provide their perspectives on what you have just heard about Columbia River Treaty modernization. It's going to be short. Each person only has 7 minutes. In the interest of time, they will introduce themselves. And while that's a very short time period to talk, what it is an opportunity for you to hear from a group of highly informed representatives of citizens and sovereigns to help you begin to think about what you want to bring to the table this afternoon in the breakout sessions. So we hope it will really tee up that process. And so without further ado, we are going to begin with first. And you can just speak from down there. You're welcome to come up here if you want, but I think we have microphones on. If you pull the button forward, it goes on. We're going to begin with Dr. Michelle, the Executive Director of the Upper Columbia United Tribes.
Good morning. How's everybody doing today? Good, all right. So I'd like to start off with what's good for fish is good for people. And I want to focus a little bit or talk a little bit about that third leg that was mentioned here towards the end of the last presentation and how we incorporate that in and what kind of teeth it has in this process. If it's and the concern is if we're talking about two different processes and fish is in the domestic process and all of the other treaty things are in another process. How are we going to integrate those and when? When are we going to start talking about the flows for fish passage? Some of the work that the tribes have already done, turning fish loose in the Spokane Arm, the Sampuel, some of those areas, those fish are showing us the way. And so the question again comes back to this third leg and how do we incorporate that or integrate that into a treaty that focuses on flood risk management and power production. When we talk about the salmon and those benefits, again, that gets pushed off into this domestic pile that may or may not get the proper attention it needs or direction or even involvement. And again, concern about when do we start to integrate fish passage into those operations. We have fish in the system right now. We've turned fish above Chief Joe, Grand Coulee. They're in the Spokane Arm. We've seen successful spawning in the Sampuel, in the Little Spokane. So the fish continue to show us the way, and it's our responsibility as tribal people and just as citizens to follow up on that, to help them achieve that, to live up to their end of the bargain. In our creation stories, it's talked about that salmon were one of the first ones to give up itself for us as humans and to survive. And in turn, we take care of them. It's been over 80 years. My grandparents on my mom and dad's side would have been the last ones to see salmon at Kettle Falls. So we're already 5 generations without. And I take that responsibility as a tribal member, as a citizen of the Cobble tribe, and with descendants who haven't yet heard this story, who I think it's important that we tell that story now so those future generations have that. We ensure now that we have this opportunity to get fish over those dams through this process that this door isn't going to open or isn't going to be open for very long. While we continue to focus on those things that those dams were created for, the one thing that we have to do is bring the salmon home. We got to quit talking about it. We got to quit spending money on bringing salmon home into the areas that we've been spent millions of dollars over the last 40, 50 years trying to bring the salmon home, to save the salmon, and we haven't expanded that area. We've been trying to do it. It's like the river ends at Chief Joe, and we've spent a lot of money trying to bring the salmon home, and they stop at the base of Chief Joe, and those salmon haven't forgot. People remember that. Those salmon circle the base of Chief Joe for days before they peel off and spawn. They've seen the salmon spilling on the tribal gates on the reservation side at the gates. They've seen the salmon go up around and trying to get up their steps on the side of that dam. So those fish are continuing to try to live up to their responsibility, and it's our responsibility to make sure that that happens. And concerns with this process and how we incorporate ecosystem as a domestic issue into a federal hydro power system that's focused on power, flood risk management, irrigation, and some of these other issues that are beneficial, and we're not looking to interrupt those or change those, so to speak. We're just wanting to add what was taken back out, and that is those salmon. Put them back where they belong. Let's get them home. Let's get them to the headwaters up in Canada where they belong, and celebrate that with those future generations, those folks we haven't met yet. So thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Jim Heffernan. Is that from mine or yours? I don't know. Policy analyst with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Go ahead, Jim.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the Symposium for the opportunity to talk about this on behalf of 15 tribes. And I'd have to say that carefully. I'm a policy analyst with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, who apparently is radioactive right now. And my job over the last, since 2007, has been to work to bring the 15 tribes in the Columbia River Basin whose rights, resources, management obligations, and authorities have been dramatically impacted by the implementation of the Columbia River Treaty, because it was done so initially without consultation with any of the tribes. The tribes came together over a period from 2007 to 2010, and the summer of 2010 they had a meeting with the U.S. entity, and the U.S. entity expressed a desire to consult with the 15 tribes about the future of the Columbia River Treaty. And the byword of that meeting, particularly delivered by Catherine Burgum, a chair from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, was that we don't want to consult, we want to collaborate. We want to do the modeling with you, we want to do all the work with you, we want to develop all the identify all the issues and the alternatives and solutions to those issues going forward. And the background for her saying that was the U.S.-Canada Pacific Salmon Treaty, where the tribes, the 4 treaty tribes I work for and the 20 Western Washington tribes of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission are actually co-managers under that treaty and sit at the table and co-manage the salmon resource from Southeast Alaska to the border of U.S. and Canada. So that said, that desire, that statement by tribes that they wanted to collaborate led to a process over the course of 3 years to develop a regional recommendation. Importantly, the regional recommendation was a consensus. The State Department demanded consensus of the federal agencies, the 4 states, and the 15 tribes on what their recommendations were for a modernized Columbia River Treaty. And what you'll find in that regional recommendation is the ecosystem function, of which salmon passage and reintroduction is an integral element, and flow enhancement to support that reintroduced population was a critical element of that regional recommendation. Thankfully, the State Department recognized and adopted that as guidance moving forward through the negotiations. And I think what you heard today was beginning work to integrate ecosystem function into a modernized treaty through the agreement in principle. There are definitely areas that the tribes can work and collaborate with the U.S. negotiating team on. And I think over the last several months, that is what the Columbia Basin tribes have asked for, is a closer, more substantive, involved relationship with the U.S. negotiating team, answering the questions that have come up during the negotiations. What are the best ways to solve these problems collaboratively, using joint modeling where necessary, but again, collaboration being the byword, co-management being the byword, because again, I don't mean to be trite by saying this, but water is life. The river is life for all of the resources that the tribes and the residents of the basin depend upon. And the Fish Passage and Reintroduction Program, as an example of what DR referenced, the benefits of that reintroduction program, huge for the basin, but they also benefit fisheries as far north as Southeast Alaska, ideally. That is what we'll see with the successful reintroduction program over time. So that said, what the tribes are looking for is greater involvement in helping to draft the treaty agreement, working with the U.S. State Department on, again, helping them answer the questions that are still remaining from the negotiations, and doing so in a constructive, collaborative, productive, team-building way. And I think we're looking at quickly putting forward a couple of tribal leaders with their attorneys. I would anticipate seeing the same from UCUT to begin working to the greatest extent practicable with the U.S. negotiating team on helping to fill out the treaty agreement, particularly with a focus on the JEB. I'm going to borrow that shorthand phrase, the JEB, because it's not the first time that the basin went through this exercise of trying to integrate flow enhancement for salmon. There was a water budget proposed in 1982. BPA did their dangdest to get that water budget through the process, but you can look at the 1989 report of the Permanent Engineering Board, and they said, you can't do this, this is inconsistent with the terms of the treaty, which is to optimize power production. So what the JEB does is an important step. It goes beyond that and says, let's work together, let's collaborate, and figure out a way to ensure that the fish that are being reintroduced have flow enhancement sufficient to move them out to the ocean to the benefit of everyone. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Jim. Well, I had the privilege of working for Jim for many years on the Columbia River Treaty. I retired about 2019. Figured it was time to start another life. But it's great looking around the room, seeing DR and a lot of the other people that I've worked with over the years on the treaty. And for the treaty, my focus has really been on climate change, and it goes back to a workshop that Dr. Roger Pulwarthy of NOAA, he was the head of what's now the National Drought Information Service, and I put together the first Transboundary climate change workshop in Portland, Oregon. It was a 2-day workshop, and we gathered some of the top climate scientists in the region, from Colorado, from Oregon, from Washington, and from British Columbia. And we had everybody come to the conference and offer up what they had been working on in terms of modeling climate change at that time. This is back in 2009 or 2010. And it was a really great workshop. And what came out of that is a giant study that was funded by Bonneville Power Administration called the Reservoir Joint Operating Committee. And what they did is they took the global climate models, the most recent global climate models from the International Panel of Climate Change, and over about a 3-year period and over $1 million. It was an expensive study, but they downscaled all those climate models specific for the Columbia Basin so that temperature and precipitation could be determined for the 2040 and the 2080 periods. And downscaling is a very, very complex type of operation. We're actually breaking the entire basin into 4 kilometer squares, and you're looking at the radioactive forcing from climate change coming on that area, and then putting forth projections of what's going to happen in terms of those areas. And I think they looked at 190 different sites to do that study. But that was great for temperature or not temperature, but air temperature, not water temperature and precipitation. But what we lacked was the next step, and that's creating water temperature projections from those projections. And we at the Intertribal Fish Commission, we were working with folks, scientists from the University of Washington, to come up with a proposal funded by the National Science Foundation to take that next step. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get that study implemented. It's still an urgent need. Establish a baseline for the entire basin for water temperatures, because water temperature is absolutely critical, and it's related to snow melting, snow melt equivalent, it's related to flows, it's related to oxygen levels in the river, which I think folks tomorrow when they're talking about pollution is a critical issue. So that's one of the mainstays that needs to happen. And also, just getting some better representation through the AIP on both the US and Canadian side. I believe there should be a climate scientist representative on each one of those entities, at least in an advisory role, to tell these folks what's going on, to give them the most recent information, and to coordinate with tribes and the public on both sides of the border. That's going to be absolutely critical. You know, right now we've got, and you probably all know about this, we are at or bypassing the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that the Paris Climate Accords established several years back. They said if we get past this 1.5 Celsius limit for an average of 20 years, we're not going to be able to cool down the Earth. There's going to be more and more disastrous consequences for billions of people around the Earth. And now we have potentially the United States once again pulling out of those agreements. What's going to happen to the world? I heard, coming over here yesterday on the radio, I heard conversations from representatives from the Marshall Islands, from Europe. They're just saying, well, you know, if the U.S. doesn't do it, we're going to have to figure out how to do this ourselves. It's going to be really, really difficult to do that. So in summary, I just really think that the AIP has got to be really specific in terms of addressing climate change and addressing adaptation and resilience, particularly for ecological purposes, but also for socioeconomic purposes as well. And there needs to be representation, there needs to be dedicated funding to get the work done. It can't be piecemeal, and it does need to be integrated with what's going on in the rest of the basin. So with that, I'll pass it on to Wes.
Thanks. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, now we're going to hear from representatives of local governments. We have Wes McCart, who is Stevens County Commissioner from District 1, and Stan Doyle, who is the Vice Chair of the Canada Local Governments Committee.
So I'm glad to be here today. I want to spend a couple minutes and talk about something that hasn't come up yet this morning, and that's I want to take a minute to reflect on where we are at this moment in time with the agreement in principle. Flood control was due to expire, and you know, I attended a conference that I think many of you did, Bureau of Rec put on, what would we do on the U.S. side, and we looked at the drawdowns behind Grand Coulee and what they would mean to us on the U.S. side. And I'm here to tell you, if you're concerned about irrigation or food production, when we have drawdowns that would not have allowed us to pump water back and forth between Banks Lake and the reservoir, that would have been devastating to our country, to our food supply, and to our nation. That's not just economics, that's real world issues. Transportation, you know, we just heard issues on climate change. Can you imagine if we had to truck all of our product down the river instead of using that as a transportation system also? Huge devastating effects. Having surety for water and the environment, huge devastating effects. So, you know, the treaty, or the original treaty gave us some certainty, but it gave us a lot of uncertainty. Modernizing the treaty, and even to the point we are in the agreement in principle, has given us some certainty in a lot of good ways, and it's also given us some uncertainty. What is it going to mean? What is the treaty actually going to be when they put the meat on the bones? To actually quote Kathy there. You know, I've got a lot of folks at home that are extremely concerned about what that's going to mean. And my message to you is, look at this as an opportunity. We're talking about bringing salmon behind Grand Coulee and Chief Joe, and now up to the rest of the system. I've spoke at many different forums over the last many years about, you know, we keep trying to do the same thing over and over to bring salmon, more salmon back into our system within the same little area we keep working on, when we've got literally thousands of acres of opportunity to bring salmon back into the system with working, if we open it up behind Grand Coulee and Chief Joe. And this agreement in principle, in my perspective, gives us that opportunity to work with our tribes on both sides of the border, the First Nations and the tribes, to try and bring those salmon back. That's economic opportunity, that's cultural opportunity, that's social opportunity. I know we and local government here on the U.S. side have been strongly supportive of the UCUT proposal, and love the opportunity that we can expand that into Canada. The other thing I'm going to say is that during the negotiations, or I should say prior to the negotiations, local governments on both sides of the border were meeting on a regular basis. And during the treaty negotiations, that somewhat stopped. And it stopped because as local government, I get to be involved in a lot of negotiations, and I'm here to tell you folks, they're not easy. I applaud all these folks on both sides of the border for the effort that they've done. I know what it's like to sit in negotiations with people on the other side, and no matter how hard you want to work to the same goal, getting there is always difficult. And I think this is another opportunity for local governments to re-engage now that we have the agreement in principle and help bring more to the table. And I hope that there's a spot for that ongoing conversation, because I know, you know, where it's nice to hear from the people, local government, we're the ones that you see in the grocery store. We're the ones you see at the gas station. So we're able to carry that message. And I hope that as the meat is put on the bones in this agreement in principle, that there's more opportunity to bring local governments on both sides of the border into that, so that we can play the role that we're meant to play in instituting our governments on both sides and representing all of the people that we can engage. And I also will leave you with one more statement, and that's, I see this agreement in principle in this interim period. I've seen some pretty amazing things to me in the ability to implement these new ideas under the existing treaty prior to having it negotiated and certified by both governments, the Senate and I don't even know what the federal process is in Canada, but I'm here to tell you, look at this as a test period. We can make a few mistakes in the next couple of years as it gets ratified, and I think that will help us solidify a better treaty in the long run. So I applaud the fact that we're here. I applaud the fact that we have some opportunities, and I hope we have the opportunity to work together. Thank you.
Anyway, good morning, folks. It's a pleasure to be here. I am the Regional Director for the area around Koocanusa Reservoir in BC and the Vice Chair of the BC Columbia River Local Governments Committee. The committee chair, Linda Worley, sends her regrets as she could not travel for medical reasons. I am honored to represent the committee on this panel. Thank you for the opportunity to share the current views of the BC Columbia River Treaty Local Governments Committee on Treaty Modernization. The committee includes 10 elected officials appointed by local government organizations in the BC portion of the Columbia Basin. Since 2011, the committee has worked to ensure the voices of basin residents and local governments are heard in any decisions about the future of the treaty. I'd also like to recognize Cindy Pierce. Cindy's our executive assistant. Cindy keeps us out of trouble. So cheers to her. The agreement is a milestone that signals that there is much work to do to create and implement a modernized treaty. The committee responses to the questions posed on the panel are based on what we currently know about treaty modernization. We respect that our views may change as we learn more, and many elements of the agreement are further development. So what is good about the agreement? The committee congratulates the Canadian, US, and CRT negotiating teams for having reached an agreement in principle over 6 years of negotiations. This is an exceptional achievement for the 5 governments in Canada who have worked together to reach this agreement on a complex international treaty. This includes the federal, provincial, Tanaka Nation, Shrepnek Nation, Silks, Okanagan Nation. We understand that it's first in Canada. We greatly appreciate several aspects of the AIP. The agreement to allocate a portion of the reservoir storage for Canadian flexibility is great news. Hopefully this will be implemented as swiftly as possible following engagement with basin residents and local governments to reduce the current reservoir fluctuations. The ongoing roles of Indigenous nations in BC in the development of the new specified operations, as well as Indigenous and tribal leadership of the Joint Ecosystem and Cultural Values Board, signal the beginning of respectful recognition of Indigenous tribes and tribal rights related to the management of the Columbia River Treaty. The creation of the Coutney Transboundary Working Group is good news. We hope this proceeds quickly, and the elements to support further salmon restoration in BC are very much appreciated. The next point is beyond the agreement itself, but it is essential. The committee greatly appreciates the province's commitment to fully explain the AIP and seek input from Canadian Columbia Basin residents and local governments in the community and other meetings. We look forward to hearing from residents and local governments in the Canadian Columbia Basin about their perspective on the AIP. We will consider what we hear at these meetings and then recommend refinements to the AIP and on a broader treaty modernization. We greatly appreciate the province's commitment to consider public input for refinements to the AIP before the modernized treaty is finalized. What you don't like about the agreement? We are still hearing about several aspects of the agreement to fully understand the content and implications for basin residents and local governments. We've not yet identified anything we don't like about it, but we have identified several important missing elements. What is needed but missing from the agreement? These are our initial thoughts on what is missing. While the reduced reliance on BC reservoirs for assured flood risk management is encouraging, we are very concerned that called upon operations have not been resolved. We hope this will be sorted out before the freshet next spring with opportunities for community engagement. The creation of the JEB is encouraging. However, the JEB only has an advisory role in its scope, and engagement beyond ecosystem function and Indigenous cultural values with the stated membership is uncertain. This is concerning as the committee's 2021 recommendation includes adding Indigenous representation and ecosystem expertise on the CRT decision-making bodies, with advisory roles from local governments and ongoing meaningful public engagement, which isn't addressed in this agreement. Active adapted management is going to be essential as the new operations resulting from the AIP are implemented in a changing climate. The AIP assigns adaptive management to the JEB, which has an advisory role only without clarity about the scope or engagement beyond ecosystem function and Indigenous cultural values with the stated JEB membership. It sounds as though adaptive management will be advisory only and may not include social economic interests and representatives, which are concerning to the committee. The committee encourages full transparency throughout the modernization process, beginning with the drafting of diplomatic notes or interim agreements to implement the agreement, with the ongoing engagement with the public and local governments as the documents in the AIP are developed. This is not clearly stated in the AIP. The committee will continue to be active through the modernization process and the implementation of the Modernized Treaty. And I thank you for listening. Thank you.
Now we'll hear from environmental NGOs. We have with us Martin Carver, who's with the Upper Columbia Basin Environmental Collaborative, and Joseph Bogard, who's with Save Our Wild Salmon and also the co-lead of the U.S. Columbia River Treaty Conservation Caucus.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Good morning. It's a great honor to be here with you all today and with the entire negotiating team. I am the lead for the Upper Columbia Basin Environmental Collaborative. We are a partnership of local, regional, and provincial environmental voices from Canada. And we have membership from BC Nature, WildSite, Living Lakes Canada, Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, the Friends of Coutney Lake Stewardship Society, and a WildSite group based in Revelstoke, in addition to 15 supporters. And collectively, we represent thousands of individuals throughout the region, the Upper Columbia Basin. We are very pleased with a number of aspects of the agreement in principle, and I'd like to go through three in particular that at the beginning of these comments. The flexibility in how Canada can manage storage in its reservoirs is a great achievement and makes possible for BC to explore options to begin to address the devastating legacy of environmental and social losses in the Upper Columbia Basin. In addition, the formal role of First Nations in the JEB begins to recognize Indigenous perspectives and provides a mechanism for Indigenous knowledge to influence dam operations and reservoir management. So we're very supportive of this. Thirdly, the KTCW, the Coutney Transboundary Group, provides an opportunity for developing cross-border collaboration while addressing management issues associated with this complex basin. And combined with the JEB, these are opportunities to foster a collaborative culture, which we've heard a lot about this morning. So those are three aspects that we're very supportive of. But of course, there are always, these are very positive, but there are always concerns. And elsewhere in the AIP, there are aspects that are either unaddressed or content that we're concerned may signal a lack of commitment to ensure the potential of the positives are fully realized. And I'd like to go through 5 points there. We've talked a bit this morning about the fact that ecosystem function has not been established as a third treaty purpose, with hydropower and flood risk management being maintained as the only formal objectives of the treaty. Now, of course, instead we see the ambiguous term ecosystem health that it will be added to the preamble. Now that's positive, but we're not really sure what the implications would be of that. And I think the Q&A this morning did speak to that a bit. But ultimately, we don't understand why it hasn't just been made a third objective of the treaty. So second, then the new guidance and recommendations for ecosystem health and adaptive management emerging in the JEB, they're advisory capacity only. I think people have spoken a bit about this, and so far they're restricted to First Nations and tribes, but we are perhaps seeing the emergence of a defined process for inclusion of Western science or non-Indigenous knowledge. So further clarity there would be very helpful. The increased certainty on provision of fish flows from Canada contributes a key component to sustainability of fish populations, especially in dry years. This is positive, but we still are concerned about a lack of U.S. commitment to effectively utilize the augmented fish flows. And I know we heard that discussion this morning, so we would be looking for that. Membership and decision-making of the entities, the Permanent Engineering Board and the Operations Committee are unchanged, yet objectives and expertise associated with ecosystem function are unquestionably needed in these entities, in these governance bodies. And lastly, another subject from this morning, there continues to be a lack of clear guidance on implementation of called upon flood risk management. Raises concerns because it could jeopardize ecosystem objectives. So the implications then, if the potential of the AIP is to be realized, from UCBEC's perspective, there's a few points that we would turn to. But before I say that it also is important to note that if BC doesn't follow through domestically with appropriate measures that take advantage of the flexibility that BC has negotiated, then the potential positive environmental outcomes may be in question. So that's another background concern. So the first point then would be, again, reforming the objectives to add ecosystem function as a third treaty and reorganize the treaty appropriately. Well, you know, there's a lot we don't know about what the treaty language will be. Perhaps it will be linked together. There's a comment. We would suggest reforming the governance structure to include a clear and effective role for institutions and expertise relevant to implementing ecosystem function. Third, we would look for firm commitments to adaptive management and climate change planning to assure and strengthen advances in ecosystem function. This is speaking to the advisory role that we see at the moment. So fourth, creating effective mechanisms for ongoing public consultation for both the public at large and local communities, for example, local governments, including transparency and review opportunities during this interim period as the negotiation process moves from the AIP to the final treaty language. For instance, the terms of reference of the collaborative bodies. And lastly, we would look for the provision of meaningful support for public education around Columbia Basin management. So thank you for the opportunity to share these views from UCBEC.
Thanks, Martin. Listening to Martin, I realize there's a lot of overlapping concerns and messages that was totally spontaneous. We didn't coordinate beforehand. I'll just start by saying thank you for organizing the symposium. It's an honor to be here with you all. It's an honor to be able to speak and share our views, my views, on behalf of the caucus. And it's also fantastic to be here and listen and learn. This morning's panel discussion was helpful in that regard. I had prepared notes before this morning that are now full with all sorts of scrawls because they needed to be sort of updated and adapted, and I hope you'll bear with me. I also want to sort of send out a special message of gratitude to the young people who are here and the symposium for making a point of creating opportunities to host this, and just appreciate your time being here. You're caring for these issues, and I want to echo maybe what was said earlier today about the rest of us who aren't in that class, remembering to center their interests and values and for future generations in our work here today and moving forward. My name is Joseph Bogart. I'm the Executive Director of the Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition. I'm here today representing the U.S. Columbia River Treaty Conservation Caucus, We began our work back in 2012 during the development of the regional recommendation. We include today about 10 NGOs representing conservation, clean energy, faith, and civic missions and values. And we represent millions of supporters in the region and beyond. I also just want to express great gratitude and appreciate the leadership of the Indigenous nations and the tribes who have been so active and critical in the development of the AIP. And we've tried to support that up to this point, and we'll continue to do that moving forward. Our caucus appreciates the challenges of balancing multiple and often competing goals and outcomes in the basin. We support the regional recommendation as a guide to the State Department during negotiations. Having said that, our top priorities were the addition of ecosystem-based function as a new third purpose in the treaty, and an important piece of that is flow augmentation with the right timing and sufficient quantities. We strongly support including the tribes and indigenous nations on both sides of the border to bring their expertise and decision-making into the process into negotiations and to the process moving forward. And we strongly also support the modernizing governance to ensure decision-makers of the treaty and its implementation moving forward include a voice for the river, fish, and wildlife. The original treaty failed on these counts, and while there is potential and progress that's reflected in the AIP, we also have concerns that it's going to continue to fall short to uphold those important priorities. Righting these historic wrongs is essential to really meaningfully modernize the treaty, to reflect today's challenges that have been reflected in the conversation today regarding justice, regarding climate, changing hydrographs, and reflect, I think, societal values in the broader community. So we are disappointed. It was interesting hearing the panel this morning. We're disappointed that the AIP and the treaty is not formally embrace ecosystem-based function as a new third purpose. And in other ways, deliver certainty, the power and, from our perspective, power and flood risk management receive both benefits and certainty in ways that the ecosystem and the health of the river and its inhabitants did not. Our caucus members are committed to protecting and restoring healthy, abundant, anadromous fish populations across the Columbia Basin, north of the border, and the healthy river conditions they require. We support restoring passage and reintroduction of salmon and other native fish above Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams. And we're encouraged and inspired by the leadership and progress of the tribes towards achieving this in recent years and decades. This year's return of sockeye to the Okanagan River was a marvelous reminder of how resilient these fish can be when we act to meet their needs and in some ways get out of their way. The thermal block on the river this summer, however, was yet another reminder of the clear warning of what's here now and what's going to be here, continue to get worse in the future as the rivers warm and hydrographs shift. And the modernized treaty needs to have the effective tools and mechanisms to address these kinds of challenges. I'll turn towards the end. I want to maybe, excuse me, talk about a couple of the bright spots and the potential that's included in the AIP. What I think I see is progress and potential and still uncertainty. And that was reflected, I feel like, in the panel discussion this morning. In a couple specific instances, the increased flexibility that Canada has over water management its purposes and application of the 5 MAF annually. This could be used to deliver significant benefits to ecosystems, native fish, and the benefits they bring to communities, with positives on both sides of the border. And we really hope that that potential is realized in the years ahead, but we won't know. I don't feel we know that now. Second, the caucus views the JEB as another potentially very important development in addition to the treaty. However, we're concerned about the JEB's advisory role and status, and concerned that the recommendations that it advances to address important ecological challenges and opportunities may not be centered in decision-making in the overall treaty. We support a much stronger and certain co-management role for the Indigenous nations and tribes in the basin and as members and leaders on the JEB. Maybe the last thing I'll say to conclude has to do with the sort of progress, potential, and uncertainty. Everyone in this room has an interest in this process, and I'll bet everyone in this room has played a role in bringing it to this point. One of the take-home messages, I think, for me today, and it emerged this summer in response to the announcement of the AIP, is the importance of those that kind of participation to bring us to this point, with both the progress, the potential, and the uncertainty, and the importance of all of us and many more continuing to lean in, hold our decision makers in these processes accountable, support the leadership of the Indigenous nations and tribes and others to ensure that the treaty reaches its potential and promise that I think many of us hold for it. So with that, I'll leave it. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for all you do. And that concludes this panel. We did not set this one up for question and answer. And so, should I turn it back to you? So we'll now talk to you about what stands between you and lunch.
Thanks, Barb. As noted, that concludes our panel sessions for this morning. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so there we go. It gives people a little bit of extra time to do some networking, check out the poster and the various comments from the previous symposium. They're just getting lunch out now, so give them a couple more minutes, and then we'll be ready to start lunch. We will be reconvening at 1 o'clock sharp. I will give you warning for when 1 o'clock comes in order to start our panel 3 conversations around climate change. So take a moment, and you have a few extra minutes to, as I say, continue to network, and lunch should be finished being set out shortly. Thanks.